In this video, we're going to be exploring 3 hours of forgotten Family Guy lore to fall asleep to. Let's get started with the story that almost never happened. Because the man who created everything you're about to hear nearly died before any of it could exist. The most profitable animated series revival in television history started with a college kid drawing in his kitchen at 4 in the morning. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on October 26, 1973 in Kent, Connecticut, a quiet town in Litchfield County, where his father Ronald worked as a teacher and his mother Anne served as an academic administrator at the local boarding school. By the time he was 2 years old, MacFarlane was already sketching Woody Woodpecker and Fred Flintstone on whatever paper he could find. His parents bought him an 8mm movie camera when he was still in grade school, and he immediately started making rudimentary science fiction shorts in the backyard. The kid was obsessed with animation before he even understood what the word meant. But the real turning point came when MacFarlane was 14 years old. He watched his first episode of The Simpsons, the Fox animated series that was tearing through American pop culture in the late 1980s. Before that moment, MacFarlane had assumed his future lay with Disney. He wanted to draw for them, work in their studios, maybe end up crafting the next Little Mermaid or Beauty and the Beast. The Simpsons changed that calculation entirely. Here was an animated show made for adults, airing in prime time, pulling massive ratings, and doing comedy that no live-action sitcom would dare attempt. MacFarlane realised right then that primetime animation was where he wanted to be. After graduating from Kent School in 1991, MacFarlane enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design, better known as RISD, in Providence. He majored in animation and threw himself into the program with an intensity that his classmates would later describe as borderline compulsive. He performed stand-up comedy on campus, he starred in student films, and he met a guy named Patrick Henry, whose brother Mike would eventually become one of the core voice actors on Family Guy decades later. The connections MacFarlane made at RISD weren't just academic. They were the foundation of an empire that didn't exist yet. During his senior year, MacFarlane poured everything into his thesis film. He called it The Life of Larry, and it was a roughly 10-minute animated short about a middle-aged slob named Larry Cummings, his cynical talking dog Steve, his patient wife Lois, and his overweight teenage son Milt. MacFarlane created the film almost entirely by himself, with only a couple of classmates helping film a brief live-action segment. The animation was crude, the jokes were raunchy, and the structure relied heavily on cutaway gags that interrupted the main narrative with random pop culture references and absurd tangents. If any of that sounds familiar, it should. Larry Cummings became Peter Griffin. Steve the talking dog became Brian Griffin. The wife kept her name Lois, and Milt, the overweight teenage son, became Chris Griffin. Even the voice was the same. MacFarlane based Peter's voice on a security guard he once overheard talking while walking through the RISD campus. That random overheard conversation became one of the most recognizable character voices in animation history. The Life of Larry screened at RISD's Senior Film Festival in 1995, and sitting in that audience was a woman named Ellen Cockrell, the head of development at Hanna-Barbera Productions. Cockrell didn't just enjoy the short, she offered MacFarlane a development position on the spot. A professor at RISD had actually submitted MacFarlane's thesis to Hanna-Barbera beforehand, which is how Cockrell ended up at the screening in the first place. MacFarlane graduated in 1995 with a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree and moved to Los Angeles to start his career. He was 21 years old, and Hollywood was about to find out what happens when you hand an animation obsessive a professional platform. At Hanna-Barbera, MacFarlane worked as both a writer and animator on several Cartoon Network shows. He contributed to Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. He spent the most time on Johnny Bravo because that show used a script writing process that the others didn't, and MacFarlane found it easier to develop his own creative style through written scripts rather than pure storyboarding. He also freelanced for Walt Disney Television Animation, writing for a show called Jungle Cubs, and for the Canadian studio Nelvana, where he wrote for Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. Years later, MacFarlane would say that the Disney work was extremely valuable preparation for his career, particularly in teaching him about story progression, character stakes, and plot structure. But MacFarlane never stopped thinking about Larry. He created a sequel short called Larry and Steve, which kept the middle-aged everyman protagonist and his intellectual talking dog, but refined the animation and comedy. Cartoon Network broadcast Larry and Steve as part of their world premiere Toons lineup in 1997. The short caught the attention of executives at Fox Broadcasting, who saw both Larry films and recognized something in MacFarlane's work that they wanted on their network. Fox signed MacFarlane to a production deal worth between $2 and $2.5 million per season in May of 1998. The exact figure depends on which source you check, but either way, it was an extraordinary sum for a creator who was only 24 years old and had never produced a television series. MacFarlane later described the experience to the New York Times by saying he spent about 6 months with no sleep and no life, just drawing like crazy in his kitchen and doing the pilot. That kitchen table work became the first episode of Family Guy. The show premiered on January 31st, 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 33. Fox had deliberately placed the debut in the most valuable time slot in American television, right after the biggest sporting event of the year. The pilot episode, called Death Has a Shadow, pulled approximately 22 million viewers, which remains the highest single episode viewership figure in the entire history of Family Guy. When the show moved to its regular time slot, it landed on Sundays at 8:30 p.m, sandwiched between The Simpsons and The X-Files. That's the kind of real estate that networks kill for. Season 1 averaged over 14 million viewers and ranked number 33 in the Nielsen ratings. MacFarlane was 25 years old. He was the creator, executive producer, head writer, and voice of 3 main characters on a show that had just debuted to one of the largest audiences in Fox animation history. The kid who had been sketching Woody Woodpecker at age 2 was now running his own primetime animated series. Everything was pointing upward. Everything suggested that Family Guy would become one of the biggest shows on television. However, what happened next is the part of this story that gets forgotten or overlooked entirely. Because before the cancellation, before the DVD revolution, before any of the comeback narrative that we'll get to later, something happened to Seth MacFarlane on September 11th, 2001 that nearly erased this entire story from existence. On the morning of September 11th, MacFarlane was scheduled to fly from Boston to Los Angeles on American Airlines Flight 11. He had been in Rhode Island the night before, giving a lecture at his alma mater, RISD. After the event, he went out for drinks with friends. He stayed out too late, he drank too much, and when he woke up the next morning, he was badly hungover. To make things worse, his travel agent had given him the wrong departure time. The agent listed the flight as leaving at 8:15 a.m. when it actually departed at 7:45 a.m. Between the hangover and the incorrect schedule, MacFarlane arrived at Boston's Logan International Airport roughly 10 to 15 minutes after the gate had already closed. He couldn't board the flight. The gate attendant told him he was too late. So MacFarlane, frustrated and still nursing his headache, walked to the airport lounge, sat down and fell asleep. He woke up about 40 minutes later, and the flight he was supposed to be on had crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. American Airlines. Flight 11 was the first plane hijacked that morning. It carried 81 passengers and 11 crew members, all of whom died in the impact. Among the passengers were David Angel, the co-creator and executive producer of the sitcom Frasier, along with his wife Lynn. Actor Mark Wahlberg had also originally been booked on Flight 11 but changed his plans the day before and flew to Toronto for a film festival instead. MacFarlane later talked about the experience in multiple interviews. He told one interviewer that he was booked on that flight, that he was drinking the night before, and that he was hungover. In a conversation on the Howard Stern show, he described going to sleep in the lounge and waking up to learn what had happened. When asked if the experience made him feel like he was on borrowed time or that fate had intervened, MacFarlane gave what he called a dull, boring answer. He said he wasn't much of a fate person. He believed coincidences happen. He'd missed other flights for the same reason. He acknowledged that it was rattling for the first few weeks, but said he didn't allow the event to define his outlook on life. Think about what that means for everything that came after. The cancellation and miraculous revival of Family Guy, the creation of American Dad, the Cleveland Show, the TED films, the Orville, the entire landscape of adult animation that MacFarlane helped shape over the following 2 decades. All of Seth MacFarlane's post-2001 creative output, worth billions of dollars in aggregate, exists because a hangover and a wrong departure time kept him off a doomed flight. The voices you hear when Peter Griffin says something ridiculous, when Stewie launches into one of his theatrical monologues, when Brian delivers a dry observation about the absurdity of everything around him. All 3 of those voices belong to Seth MacFarlane. They almost didn't exist past September 11th, 2001, but they do. And the story of how Family Guy went from that near catastrophe to becoming one of the longest-running animated series in American television history involves a cancellation that should have killed the show permanently, a DVD sales phenomenon that nobody saw coming, and a late-night cable network that accidentally resurrected a franchise worth close to $1 billion. The Life of Larry began as a college thesis film created by a 21-year-old animation student at the Rhode Island School of Design in 1995. The short featured characters who would become Peter, Brian, Lois, and Chris Griffin, with Peter's voice based on a security guard MacFarlane overheard on campus. After Hanna-Barbera executive Ellen Cockrell offered MacFarlane a development position based on the film, he created the sequel Larry and Steve for Cartoon Network in 1997, which caught Fox's attention. Fox signed MacFarlane to a multi-million-dollar deal in May 1998, and Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, following Super Bowl 33 to approximately 22 million viewers. MacFarlane was 25 years old. On September 11th, 2001, he narrowly avoided death when a hangover and an incorrect departure time from his travel agent caused him to miss American Airlines Flight 11 by roughly 15 minutes. The plane, carrying 81 passengers, including Frasier co-creator David Angel and his wife, crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. MacFarlane later described the experience as rattling, but maintained he wasn't much of a fate person, calling it a coincidence rather than divine intervention. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the death and resurrection of Family Guy, the cancellation nobody expected and the comeback nobody thought was possible. Here's something that people forget about Family Guy. The show didn't just get cancelled once. It got cancelled, received a last-minute reprieve, got cancelled again, and then spent 3 years completely off the air before coming back in a way that had never happened before in television history. The whole saga is one of the strangest survival stories in entertainment. The trouble started almost immediately after that promising first season. Fox executives looked at Family Guy's 14 million average viewers and its number 33 Nielsen ranking and decided the show deserved a better time slot, or at least what they thought was a better time slot. At the start of season 2, Fox moved Family Guy from its comfortable Sunday night position between The Simpsons and The X-Files to Thursday at 9 p.m. This was a disaster. Thursdays were dominated by NBC's must-see TV lineup, and Family Guy wasn't built to compete in that arena. The ratings dropped immediately. Season 2 averaged only 6.74 million viewers, a staggering fall from the 14 million of Season 1. To make things worse, Fox didn't even keep the show in one consistent slot. Season 2 was pulled from the schedule entirely at one point, then returned on March 7th, 2000 on Tuesdays at 8:30 p.m, then got shuffled again to Thursdays at 8 p.m. on November 8th, 2001. The show was being bounced around the schedule like a pinball, never staying in one place long enough to build a loyal audience. In May 2000, Fox formally announced the cancellation of Family Guy. The show was done, over, 3 seasons and out. But then something unexpected happened. Enough internal advocacy and residual audience interest convinced Fox to give the show one more shot. On July 24, 2000, the network ordered 13 additional episodes that would form Season 3. It wasn't a full vote of confidence. It was more like a stay of execution. Season 3 didn't help matters. The viewership continued to slide, averaging just 4.50 million viewers and ranking 125th among all television shows. For context, that's about 1/3 of what the show had drawn in its debut season. The episodes aired sporadically throughout 2001 and into 2003, with long gaps between new installments that made it impossible to maintain any kind of audience momentum. On May 15, 2002, Fox unveiled its full lineup for the upcoming television season. Family Guy was nowhere on it. The show was officially cancelled for the second time, and this time there was no reprieve. No last-minute order for additional episodes. No behind-the-scenes lobbying to save it. The final episode of the original run had aired, and Family Guy was dead. The show was off the air from approximately February 14th, 2002 to May 1st, 2005. That's a gap of more than 3 years. In television, 3 years off the air is an eternity. Shows that get cancelled for 3 years don't come back. They become trivia answers. They get mentioned in whatever happened to articles. They fade. Family Guy didn't fade. It did something that no television show had ever done before. The first piece of the puzzle fell into place on April 20th, 2003, when Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block began airing reruns of Family Guy. Adult Swim, which occupied Cartoon Network's late-night programming hours, was rapidly growing into a cultural force among young adults and college students. The block was built on irreverent animation and absurdist humour, and Family Guy fit the brand perfectly. The Adult Swim reruns were an instant hit. Ratings for the Family Guy reruns rivaled or exceeded the numbers the show had been pulling during its original Fox run. Young viewers who had missed the show during its initial broadcast discovered it for the first time. Fans who remembered the show from its Fox days returned to watch episodes they'd loved. The Adult Swim audience was passionate, vocal, and exactly the demographic that advertisers wanted to reach. Here's where the story gets genuinely unprecedented. During the same week that Family Guy debuted on Adult Swim in April 2003, the DVD box sets of seasons 1 and 2 were released. The timing was coincidental, but the result was extraordinary. Within 1 month, the DVD set sold approximately 400,000 copies. By the time the dust settled, the first and second season box set had moved 2.2 million copies, making it the best-selling television DVD of 2003 and the second highest-selling television DVD ever at that point, behind only the first season of Chappelle's Show. The Season 3 DVD release followed and sold over 1 million copies on its own. Nobody had seen anything like this before. A cancelled television show was generating massive revenue through DVD sales, while simultaneously pulling strong ratings on a cable network that had nothing to do with the original broadcaster. The economics were impossible to ignore. Fox was sitting on a property that audiences clearly wanted, and the network wasn't making a dime from the Adult Swim reruns or the DVD sales that other companies were profiting from. On May 20th, 2004, Fox made television history by ordering 35 new episodes of Family Guy. The announcement was explicitly described as the first TV show revival driven primarily by DVD sales. Nothing like this had ever happened. Shows had been saved by letter-writing campaigns. Shows had been picked up by different networks after cancellation. But no show had ever been brought back from the dead, because fans went out and bought physical copies of the old episodes in numbers that made network executives reconsider their cancellation. Season 4 of Family Guy premiered on May 1st, 2005. 3 years and 2 months after the show had been taken off the air. The return was covered by entertainment media as a genuine cultural event. Viewers tuned in to see if the show could recapture whatever magic had made those early seasons resonate strongly enough to survive cancellation through sheer audience demand. It could. Season 4 averaged 7.90 million viewers, a massive jump from the 4.50 million of Season 3. Season 5 pushed even higher, reaching 8.69 million, which was actually stronger than any season the show had produced before cancellation, except the debut. Family Guy hadn't just survived, it had come back stronger. The revival changed how the entertainment industry thought about catalogue content and the value of completed television series. DVD sales as a metric for audience demand became a legitimate part of renewal conversations at every major network. The Family Guy model proved that cancellation didn't have to be permanent, that audiences could speak with their wallets, and that the right show on the right platform could generate enough economic pressure to reverse what had seemed like a final decision. In 2009, Family Guy received a nomination for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series. This was historic. It was the first time an animated show had received that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, nearly 50 years earlier. The show didn't win, but the nomination alone signaled that the television establishment had accepted Family Guy as a legitimate creative force, rather than just a crude cartoon that happened to sell DVDs. There's another detail from this era that often gets lost in the bigger revival narrative, and it involves one of the show's main characters. During the first season of Family Guy, the character of Meg Griffin, the teenage daughter and frequent punching bag of the Griffin household, was voiced by actress Lacey Chabert. Chabert was also appearing on the television series Party of Five at the time, and the scheduling conflicts between the two shows became unmanageable. She also cited conflicts with her schoolwork as a factor. After voicing Meg for approximately the first 7 to 9 episodes, depending on which source you check, Chabert left the show. Her replacement was a 15-year-old actress named Mila Kunis. When Kunis auditioned for the role, MacFarlane called her back and gave her a single note: "Speak slower." That adjustment was apparently all it took. Kunis became Meg Griffin and has voiced the character for over 2 decades since. The transition was so smooth that most viewers at the time never noticed the voice had changed. Today, Kunis's version of Meg is so firmly established that many fans don't even know Chabert originated the role. The cancellation and revival saga of Family Guy fundamentally altered the relationship between television networks, audiences, and physical media. The show proved that viewer demand could exist in forms that traditional Nielsen ratings couldn't capture, that a passionate fan base willing to purchase content could generate enough economic leverage to override network programming decisions, and that the line between a cancelled show and a dormant franchise was thinner than anyone had previously understood. Family Guy was cancelled by Fox after Season 2 in May 2000, given a brief reprieve with 13 additional episodes on July 24th, 2000, then cancelled again on May 15th, 2002, when Fox excluded it from the full lineup. The show was off the air from approximately February 2002 to May 2005. During that gap, Adult Swim began airing reruns on April 20th, 2003, pulling ratings that matched the original run, while DVD box sets of the first 2 seasons sold 2.2 million copies, becoming the best-selling television DVD of 2003. Season 3 DVDs sold over 1 million additional copies. On May 20th, 2004, Fox ordered 35 new episodes in what was explicitly described as the first television revival driven by DVD sales. Season 4 premiered May 1st, 2005 to 7.90 million average viewers, and Season 5 climbed to 8.69 million. In 2009, the show received its historic Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series, the first animated show nominated in that category since The Flintstones in 1961. Meanwhile, Meg Griffin's voice quietly transitioned from Lacey Chabert to a 15-year-old Mila Kunis after approximately the first 7 to 9 episodes, a change so seamless that most viewers never noticed. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to mapping the town that shouldn't exist, the impossible geography of Quahog, Rhode Island. Understanding Family Guy's world means understanding Quahog, the fictional Rhode Island town where every absurd, offensive, and occasionally touching moment in the show's 27-year history has taken place. The creators didn't just throw a pin at a map and call it a day. They built a world with specific addresses, recurring landmarks, and a geography that ranges from perfectly plausible to completely impossible, depending on what the plot needs in any given episode. The name itself is the first clue that this town was designed by someone who actually knew New England. A quahog is a type of hard-shell clam that's native to the coastal waters of the northeastern United States. It's the kind of regional detail that only someone who spent years in Rhode Island would think to use as the name of a fictional town. Seth MacFarlane studied at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, and the influence of that city and the broader New England region saturates every aspect of Quahog's design. The architecture, the weather, the social dynamics, the way characters talk about Boston as both a nearby destination and a rival city. All of it reflects MacFarlane's years in Providence. The Griffin family lives at 31 Spooner Street, an address that has appeared in multiple episodes across more than 2 decades of the show. The house is a 2-story suburban home that sits in a middle-class neighborhood, appropriate for a family supported by Peter's various blue-collar jobs at the happy-go-lucky toy factory, the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, and whatever other employer the writers need him to work for in any given season. The house features the kind of generic New England residential design that you'd find in thousands of real Rhode Island neighborhoods, with clapboard siding and a front yard that never seems to need mowing, despite Peter barely being able to dress himself most mornings. What makes the geography interesting is how the show positions each character's home to reflect their social and economic status. The Griffin's house at 31 Spooner Street sits in a comfortable middle-class area. Joe Swanson, the paraplegic police officer, lives right next door, which makes sense given that his government salary would place him in a similar economic bracket. Glenn Quagmire, the hypersexual airline pilot, lives on the other side, and his house serves as a location for countless gags involving his questionable personal life. Cleveland Brown, before his departure to the spin-off and subsequent return, lived across the street. This tight geographic clustering of the 4 main adult male characters allows the show to move between their homes without requiring any narrative justification for how they all ended up in the same place. The Drunken Clam serves as the primary adult gathering location in Quahog, functioning the same way that Moe's Tavern does in The Simpsons or the bar in Cheers. Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland gather there to drink, watch sports, and discuss whatever disaster is unfolding that week. The bar has maintained a remarkably consistent interior design across seasons, featuring a long wooden bar with stools, booth seating along the walls, and a general atmosphere of comfortable seediness that feels authentic to small-town New England drinking establishments. The owner Horace appeared in dozens of episodes before being killed off, after which Jerome took over the establishment. The Drunken Clam provides the show with a location where adult characters can interact without children present, allowing for conversations and situations that wouldn't work in the family home setting. The Pewterschmidt mansion represents the economic extreme that Quahog apparently contains within its borders. Lois Griffin's parents, Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt, live in a massive estate that's depicted as a multi-wing mansion with extensive grounds, a staff of servants, and every luxury that old money can buy. Carter is a billionaire industrialist who has made his fortune through arms dealing and general plutocratic behaviour. The existence of this mansion, within the same small New England town where Peter Griffin works at a toy factory, creates the kind of economic contradiction that would be impossible in reality, but works perfectly within the show's satirical framework. Quahog somehow contains both working-class neighbourhoods and billionaire estates, and nobody seems to find this remarkable. James Woods Regional High School provides the educational setting for Meg and Chris Griffin, along with various recurring student characters like Connie D'Amico and Neil Goldman. The school was named after the actor James Woods, who has appeared in multiple Family Guy episodes, sometimes as himself and sometimes as a fictionalized version of himself who interacts with the Griffin family. The school building and its surrounding grounds provide settings for storylines about teenage social hierarchies, school events, and the various humiliations that Meg endures as the family's eternal punching bag. Quahog Channel 5. News operates from somewhere within the town, serving as the local television news station, where Tom Tucker anchors alongside various co-anchors and field reporters. The news station provides a convenient mechanism for the show to comment on local and national events through in-universe news broadcasts. Tricia Takanawa, the Asian field correspondent, voiced by Alex Borstein, reports from locations around Quahog and has become one of the show's most recognizable recurring characters, despite rarely being central to main storylines. Goldman's Pharmacy, run by the neurotic and perpetually anxious Mort Goldman, serves as another recurring business location in the town. Mort's Pharmacy provides the setting for interactions between the adult characters and serves as a reminder of the small-town commercial landscape where everyone knows each other and frequents the same local businesses. The geographic impossibilities in Quahog reveal the same creative priorities that we see in shows like The Simpsons, where Springfield's location is deliberately left ambiguous, and South Park, where the Colorado mountain town can apparently contain deserts, oceans, and anything else the plot requires. Quahog sits on the Rhode Island coast in some episodes, placing it near the ocean, with beaches and harbours that characters can visit for recreational storylines. In other episodes, the ocean seems to vanish entirely, replaced by whatever geography the current story needs. Distance to major cities shifts wildly, depending on narrative convenience. Boston appears as both a nearby destination that characters can drive to within a single scene and a distant city that requires significant planning and travel time. New York City sometimes feels like a neighbouring town, and sometimes feels like it's on the other side of the country. These inconsistencies don't bother viewers because the show has never asked its audience to take Quahog's geography seriously. The town exists to serve comedy, not cartography. The population of Quahog fluctuates in ways that defy any rational explanation. Town meetings and public events sometimes attract what appears to be a few dozen residents, suggesting Quahog is a tiny hamlet where everyone knows everyone. Other episodes depict the town as having the infrastructure and population of a small city, complete with multiple hospitals, a full police department, a functioning municipal government, and enough residents to support specialised businesses like the various restaurants and shops that appear throughout the series. The road system in Quahog connects to the broader world in whatever way the plot demands. Characters drive to other states with varying degrees of difficulty. They fly from what appears to be a local airport. They access highways and interstates that materialise when needed and disappear when they're not relevant. The show never bothers with consistent travel logistics because doing so would constrain the storytelling flexibility that allows Peter Griffin to end up in a medieval jousting tournament one week and a submarine adventure the next. One of the most interesting aspects of Quahog's design is how it handles the passage of time in relation to its physical spaces. Buildings and businesses that appear in early seasons may vanish without explanation in later seasons, replaced by completely different establishments. New locations materialize when the plot requires them, fully formed and ready to serve whatever narrative function the writers need. This approach treats the town as a malleable stage set rather than a fixed geographic location, which is actually more honest about how animated shows function than the elaborate world building that some other series attempt. The Season 8 premiere, Road to the Multiverse, introduced an elegant solution to any and all geographic or continuity problems that Family Guy might ever face. In that episode, Brian and Stewie travel through parallel dimensions using a specialized remote control, discovering versions of Quahog where the rules of reality operate differently. One universe features Disney-style animation. Another is a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Another is inhabited entirely by dogs who keep humans as pets. The episode holds the distinction of being the highest-rated Family Guy episode on IMDb, with a score of 9.1 out of 10. But beyond its entertainment value, Road to the Multiverse established within the show's own mythology that infinite versions of Quahog exist simultaneously. Every contradiction in the town's geography, population, or physical layout can be explained by the simple fact that the Family Guy universe contains multiple realities where anything is possible. The real-world geography that influenced Quahog reveals MacFarlane's deep connection to New England. Providence, Rhode Island, where he attended RISD, is a mid-sized city with a mix of old money, working-class neighborhoods, and the kind of quirky local culture that New England towns are known for. Quahog captures the feel of these communities, places where local businesses have been operating for generations, where everybody has an opinion about everybody else, and where the combination of Catholic tradition, Irish-American culture, and New England stubbornness creates a social environment that's simultaneously warm and abrasive. The Drunken Clams atmosphere reflects real New England dive bars. The Pewterschmidt Mansion represents the old money estates that dot the coasts of Rhode Island and Connecticut. The Griffin House at 31 Spooner Street looks like it belongs in any of the suburban developments that surround Providence. Even the weather in Quahog, with its snowy winters and mild summers, matches the actual climate of coastal Rhode Island. MacFarlane's genius, if we can call it that, was in creating a town specific enough to feel real and flexible enough to accommodate any story. Quahog has enough geographic detail to ground the show's more absurd moments in something recognizable. You believe that Peter could live in this neighborhood, drink at this bar, and work at this factory because the environment feels consistent with real places. But the town's borders are loose enough that an alien invasion, a time-traveling baby, or a musical number involving the entire population can happen without anyone questioning whether the infrastructure could support such events. Quahog, Rhode Island, serves as the fictional setting for Family Guy, named after a type of New England hard-shell clam and inspired by Providence, where MacFarlane attended RISD. The Griffin family lives at 31 Spooner Street in a middle-class neighborhood with neighbors Joe Swanson, Glenn Quagmire, and formerly Cleveland Brown, positioned to reflect social and economic relationships. The Drunken Clam Bar serves as the primary adult male gathering location. The Pewterschmidt Mansion represents the extreme wealth that somehow coexists with working-class homes within the same small town. James Woods Regional High School provides the educational setting for Meg and Chris. The town's geography contains deliberate impossibilities, with distances to Boston and New York shifting between episodes, population fluctuating wildly, and locations appearing or vanishing based on narrative needs. The Season 8 premiere Road to the Multiverse, the highest rated episode on IMDb at 9.1, established that infinite parallel versions of Quahog exist, providing an in-universe explanation for every geographic contradiction. The real-world influence of Providence and coastal Rhode Island gives Quahog enough authenticity to ground the show's absurdist humour in a recognisable New England setting. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the voice behind everyone, Seth MacFarlane's one-man army and the cast that rarely gets the credit they deserve. There's a detail about Family Guy that blows people's minds when they first learn it, and it's this. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter Griffin, Stewie Griffin, Brian Griffin, Glenn Quagmire, Tom Tucker, Carter Pewterschmidt, and dozens of additional minor characters. That means one human being is responsible for producing the voices of the bumbling father, the diabolical baby, the existentially depressed dog, the sex-addicted pilot, the pompous news anchor, the evil billionaire father-in-law, and countless background characters that populate Quahog across hundreds of episodes. When you're watching a scene where Peter has a conversation with Quagmire, while Brian makes a sarcastic comment and Tom Tucker delivers a news bulletin in the background, one man is performing every single one of those voices. MacFarlane didn't arrive at these voices randomly. Each one has a specific origin that reflects his influences and creative process. Peter Griffin's voice, as we already discussed, is based on a security guard MacFarlane overheard talking at RISD. The voice is a broad, working-class New England accent that conveys both stupidity and a strange kind of confidence. Peter always sounds certain about whatever idiotic thing he's saying, which is a huge part of why the character works. Stewie Griffin's voice is based on the English actor Rex Harrison, particularly his performance as Professor Henry Higgins in the 1964 musical film My Fair Lady. That's why Stewie speaks with an upper-class British accent, despite being the infant son of a working-class Rhode Island family. The contrast between Stewie's sophisticated diction and his age, his family background, and the vulgar situations he frequently finds himself in creates comedy that never gets old because the voice itself is inherently ridiculous in context. Brian Griffin's voice is the closest to MacFarlane's own natural speaking voice, which makes sense given that Brian functions as the most grounded and self-aware member of the Griffin household. Brian is the character who reads literature, drinks martinis, makes references to jazz and independent film, and generally carries himself as the intellectual superior of everyone around him. Having Brian sound like MacFarlane's real voice creates an interesting dynamic where the creator's own personality seems to be channeled most directly through the family dog. Quagmire's voice is higher pitched and more nasally than the others, with a rhythm that suggests someone who processes the world primarily through sexual impulse. The catchphrase "giggity giggity goo" emerged from MacFarlane's performance and became one of the most widely recognised phrases in animation history. Tom Tucker's voice is a smooth, authoritative anchor delivery that parodies the generic gravitas of local television news presenters across America. Since MacFarlane had such a strong vision for these characters, he chose to voice them himself because he believed it would be easier than trying to direct someone else to perform them exactly the way he heard them in his head. That decision gave him an extraordinary level of creative control over the show's identity. When you hear Family Guy, you're hearing one person's creative vision expressed through multiple distinct vocal performances, each one consistent enough to be instantly recognizable after more than 400 episodes. The financial arrangement around MacFarlane's voice work reveals something interesting about his priorities. He allocated himself just $50,000 per episode for his voice acting work. Meanwhile, the core cast members around him negotiated salaries that reached significantly higher figures. Alex Borstein, Seth Green, and Mila Kunis renegotiated their contracts to earnings that various sources place between $175,000 and $225,000 per episode, with at least one report suggesting the figure reached 300,000 at certain points. MacFarlane's decision to pay himself less for voice work than he paid his supporting cast suggests that he viewed his value to the show primarily as a creator and executive producer rather than as a performer. MacFarlane's Emmy track record as a voice actor backs up the quality of his performances. He won the Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Voiceover Performance in 2000 for the show's inaugural season, then won again in 2016, 2017, and 2019. That's 4 Emmys for voice acting alone, a remarkable achievement for someone who never trained formally as a voice actor and who took on the roles primarily because he didn't trust anyone else to get them right. There's another significant detail that gets overlooked in discussions about MacFarlane's involvement with Family Guy. During a September 2017 Reddit AMA, MacFarlane revealed that he had not actively written a script for the show since 2010. For more than a decade, the creator of Family Guy has been hands-off when it comes to the actual writing, choosing instead to focus on voice acting and high-level executive production decisions. The writing has been handled by a rotating team of showrunners and writers, including Alex Sulkin, Richard Apple, Steve Callahan, Mark Henteman, and David A. Goodman. Among many others, this means that the Family Guy you've been watching since approximately season 9 has been shaped by writers who inherited MacFarlane's creation rather than by MacFarlane himself. Now let's talk about the rest of the cast, because they rarely get the attention they deserve. Alex Borstein was asked to provide a voice for the pilot episode while she was working on the sketch comedy show Mad TV. She had never met MacFarlane. She had never seen any of his artwork or animation. She described the experience as really sight unseen, meaning she walked into the recording booth with essentially no information about what she was contributing to. At the time, Borstein was performing in a live stage show in Los Angeles where she played a red-headed mother. She based Lois Griffin's voice on one of her cousins. That improvised vocal choice became one of the most recognisable mother characters in animation. Borstein also voices several other characters on the show, including the Asian field correspondent Tricia Takanawa, Cleveland's wife Loretta Brown, and Lois's mother Barbara Pewterschmidt. She won the Emmy for Outstanding Voiceover Performance in 2018, joining MacFarlane as a recognised Emmy winner from the Family Guy cast. Seth Green voices Chris Griffin, the overweight, socially awkward teenage son. Green's audition involved performing an impression of Buffalo Bill, the serial killer from The Silence of the Lambs. The fact that a teenage cartoon character's voice is based on one of cinema's most disturbing villains tells you everything about Family Guy's sensibility. Green also voices Neil Goldman and various other minor characters throughout the series. His career outside of Family Guy includes Robot Chicken, the Adult Swim stop-motion sketch show that he co-created, which launched partially off the visibility that his Family Guy role provided. The Meg Griffin casting situation is one of those behind-the-scenes stories that quietly changed the show's DNA. Lacey Chabert originated the role in the first season but left after approximately 7 to 9 episodes due to conflicts with her schoolwork and her role on the television series Party of Five. She was replaced by Mila Kunis, who was only 15 years old at the time of her audition. MacFarlane's only note to Kunis was to speak slower. The transition happened so smoothly that contemporary viewers had no idea the voice had changed. Kunis has now voiced Meg for over 2 decades, making the character entirely her own, despite not being the original performer. Patrick Warburton voices Joe Swanson, the paraplegic police officer who serves as one of Peter's primary drinking companions at the Drunken Clam. Warburton brings a distinctive, deep, commanding voice to the role that contrasts effectively with Joe's physical limitations and occasional emotional vulnerability. Joe Swanson occupies a unique position in the show's character ecosystem as someone who is simultaneously hyper-masculine and physically dependent on others, creating comedy that walks a fine line between celebrating and satirizing disability. The Cleveland Brown recast represents one of the most significant behind-the-scenes changes in Family Guy's history and connects to a broader conversation about racial representation in voice acting that swept through the animation industry in 2020. Mike Henry, a white actor, had voiced Cleveland Brown, an African-American character, since the very first season of Family Guy. Henry voiced Cleveland for approximately 300 episodes across both Family Guy and the spin-off series The Cleveland Show. On September 25th, 2020, Henry publicly stepped down from the role, stating that persons of colour should play characters of colour. The announcement came during a period when multiple animated shows were reconsidering the practice of white actors voicing characters of colour. Jenny Slate left the role of Missy on Big Mouth. Kristen Bell stepped away from voicing Molly on Central Park. The Simpsons announced that the show would no longer have white actors voicing non-white characters. Henry's departure from Cleveland was part of this industry-wide reckoning, and it resulted in Arif Zahir being announced as the new voice of Cleveland, taking over beginning with season 20. The transition wasn't seamless. Cleveland Brown's voice had been one of the most consistent elements of Family Guy for over 2 decades, and the change was noticeable to longtime viewers. Zahir brought his own interpretation to the character, while trying to maintain enough continuity that the change wouldn't be jarring. The situation illustrated the challenge of recasting a beloved animated character, something that Family Guy had largely avoided throughout its history, thanks to MacFarlane's decision to voice most of the principal characters himself. Other notable cast changes and departures have shaped the show in ways that casual viewers might not notice. The personification of death was originally voiced by Norm Macdonald, the legendary comedian, before being taken over by Adam Carolla. Mayor Adam West was played by the real Adam West, the actor best known for portraying Batman in the 1966 television series. West voiced a fictionalized version of himself as the eccentric, somewhat delusional Mayor of Quahog from season 2 through season 17. When the real Adam West died on June 9th, 2017, the show faced the challenge of addressing his absence. The character was written out of the series and eventually replaced by Mayor Wild West, voiced by Sam Elliott, beginning in season 19. Carrie Fisher provided the voice of Angela, Peter's boss, at the brewery. When Fisher died on December 27, 2016, the character was written out of the show as well. These real-world losses affected the fictional world of Quahog in ways that the writers handled with varying degrees of sensitivity. Adam West's departure, in particular, created a genuine void in the show's humour, as the character had been a reliably absurd presence whose deadpan delivery of completely nonsensical dialogue had become a fan favourite. The production details behind the voice recording process reveal how Family Guy operates differently from most animated shows. Episodes cost approximately $2 million each to produce, a figure that has remained relatively consistent from the late 2000s through the late 2010s. Voice recording takes place in Los Angeles under the banner of Fuzzy Door Productions, MacFarlane's production company. The animation pipeline outsources much of the actual drawing and rendering to international studios, including Sunwoo Entertainment, which is common practice in the television animation industry. This outsourcing model keeps costs manageable while maintaining visual consistency across seasons. The show's animation style has evolved significantly since its early seasons. The first 8 seasons were produced in the standard 4:3 aspect ratio, giving them the slightly boxy visual appearance that defined television animation before the HD transition. Starting with season 9 in 2010, Family Guy switched to 16:9 high-definition production. The season 9 premiere, called And Then There Were Fewer, was the first episode produced in HD and the first in the widescreen format. In season 8, the production also transitioned to Toon Boom Harmony software, which achieved crisper lines, brighter colour palettes, and smoother character rigging. The aesthetic of the show remained remarkably consistent in its early years, characterized by flat, traditional, two-dimensional cell-style animation that was deliberately simple compared to shows like The Simpsons, which had more detailed character designs and backgrounds. The music deserves its own mention because it's one of the most underappreciated aspects of Family Guy's production. Walter Murphy composed the theme song and has served as the primary musical scorer for all seasons of the show. Murphy's approach was unusual for an animated comedy. He utilised a full orchestra, treating the dysfunctional storylines with sincere, cinematic musical arrangements that drew from big band, swing, and traditional Broadway aesthetics. The dissonance between the elaborate musical scoring and the crude on-screen humour became one of Family Guy's signature elements. Ron Jones served as co-composer for seasons 1 through 12, contributing additional orchestral work that elevated the show's musical identity beyond what most animated comedies attempted. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter, Stewie, Brian, Quagmire, Tom Tucker, Carter Pewterschmidt, and dozens of minor characters, basing each voice on specific inspirations. Peter came from a RISD security guard, Stewie from Rex Harrison in My Fair Lady, and Brian from MacFarlane's own speaking voice. MacFarlane allocated himself $50,000 per episode for voice work, while core cast members negotiated salaries reaching between $175,000 and $300,000 per episode. He won 4 Primetime Emmys for voice acting in 2000, 2016, 2017, and 2019, while Alex Borstein won in 2018. MacFarlane revealed in a 2017 Reddit AMA that he had not written a script for the show since 2010. Alex Borstein was cast sight unseen while working on Mad TV, basing Lois's voice on her cousin. Seth Green auditioned by impersonating Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs. Mila Kunis replaced Lacey Chabert as Meg after the first 7 to 9 episodes at age 15. Mike Henry stepped down as Cleveland Brown on September 25th, 2020, citing that persons of colour should play characters of colour, and was replaced by Arif Zahir starting season 20. Adam West voiced Mayor Adam West until his death in June 2017, and Carrie Fisher voiced Angela until her death in December 2016, with both characters written out of the show. Episodes cost approximately $2 million each to produce, with animation outsourced to international studios, including Sunwoo Entertainment. Walter Murphy and Ron Jones composed orchestral scores using a full orchestra with big band and Broadway arrangements. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the episodes they don't want you to see, the banned and buried chapters of Family Guy. Family Guy has pushed boundaries since its very first episode, but there are certain moments in the show's history where the push went so far that networks, governments, and legal systems got involved. Several episodes have been banned, pulled from circulation, or buried in ways that most viewers never learn about. These aren't just edgy jokes that made some people uncomfortable. These are episodes that crossed lines that corporate executives, national broadcasters, and international governments refused to tolerate. The most significant banned episode in Family Guy history is called Partial Terms of Endearment. It was produced as part of Season 8 and directly addressed the topic of abortion. The storyline involved Lois agreeing to serve as a surrogate mother for a college friend, only to learn that the friend and her husband had died in a car accident, leaving Lois pregnant with a child that nobody had asked for. The episode explored the question of whether Lois should continue the pregnancy or terminate it, and the writing treated the subject with a level of directness that American network television almost never attempts. Fox refused to broadcast Partial Terms of Endearment in the United States. The episode never aired on the Fox network. It was not made available on any American streaming platform. It never appeared on Hulu or Disney Plus or any other domestic distribution channel. The only way to watch this episode in the United States was and still is to purchase the DVD release, which included it as bonus content. Internationally, the episode did air on the BBC in the United Kingdom, where broadcast standards around controversial subject matter differ significantly from American network practices. The episode holds the distinction of being the only Family Guy episode that was completed, fully produced, and then permanently withheld from American broadcast, not because of a scheduling decision or a temporary removal, but because of the content itself. What makes this situation particularly notable is that Family Guy had already aired episodes involving murder, sexual assault references, drug use, racism, and virtually every other controversial topic that television can address. The show had built its brand on pushing past the boundaries of what animated comedy was supposed to do. But abortion, apparently, was the one subject that Fox executives determined could not be satirized on their network. The decision revealed an invisible hierarchy of taboo subjects in American broadcasting, where explicit violence and sexual content were tolerable, but reproductive rights remained untouchable. Partial Terms of Endearment is also notable from a production standpoint, because it was the last episode produced in the old full-screen 4:3 format before the show transitioned to widescreen HD. This technical footnote means that the banned episode occupies a unique position in Family Guy's production timeline, marking the end of one visual era and the beginning of another. The second most infamous banned episode situation involves Turban Cowboy, which aired as part of season 11. The episode originally broadcast without incident, featuring a storyline about Peter converting to Islam and various related gags. One of the episode's cutaway gags depicted Peter running over marathon runners with his car at the Boston Marathon. This was played as absurdist humour, with no connection to real-world events. On April 15th, 2013, 2 bombs exploded near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. In the days following the bombing, someone edited together a clip from the Turban Cowboy episode that combined the marathon cutaway gag with a separate explosion joke from the same episode, making it appear as though Family Guy had predicted the Boston Marathon bombing. The edited clip circulated rapidly online as a conspiracy theory, suggesting that the show had foreknowledge of the attack. The clip was a deliberate hoax. The 2 scenes were from different parts of the episode and had been artificially combined. Fox immediately pulled Turban Cowboy from Hulu and Fox.com. The episode was removed from digital distribution and has remained difficult to access through official channels since. The situation demonstrated how easily animated content can be manipulated and decontextualized in the age of viral social media, and how quickly a network will remove content when it becomes associated with real-world tragedy, regardless of whether the association is genuine or fabricated. The episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein has one of the most convoluted release histories of any Family Guy episode. It was produced as part of season 3, but was considered too controversial for Fox to air during the show's initial run. The episode involved Peter becoming convinced that he needed a Jewish person to help manage his finances, playing on stereotypes about Jewish financial acumen. The title was a parody of the Disney song When You Wish Upon a Star, and the episode included an original musical number called I Need a Jew. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein first aired on Adult Swim on November 9th, 2003, during the period when Family Guy was in cancellation limbo, and Adult Swim was running reruns. It later premiered on Fox on December 10th, 2004, after the show had been ordered back into production, but before new episodes had begun airing. In Canada, the episode was reportedly banned from broadcast on the Teletoon network. The episode also triggered a lawsuit from Born Company music publishers, who held the copyright to When You Wish Upon a Star and alleged that the parody song I Need a Jew constituted copyright infringement by pairing a thinly veiled copy of their music with anti-Semitic lyrics. The legal dispute was covered in Entertainment Trade Press. Beyond these headline cases, Family Guy has faced an ongoing pattern of censorship and content modification that most viewers never see. Streaming platforms often feature the syndicated, slightly trimmed versions of episodes rather than the uncut versions that appeared on DVD releases. Scenes that were considered acceptable for original broadcast have been altered or removed on streaming platforms years after the fact, reflecting changing sensitivities around racial humour, sexual content, and other topics that the show once addressed with less restraint. Disney Plus and Hulu have both been reported to have missing or altered episodes compared to the original broadcast versions, though the exact list of changes varies by platform and region. Some episodes feature different audio mixes, with jokes that were present in original broadcasts removed from streaming versions. These changes happen without announcement, creating situations where longtime fans notice that familiar jokes or scenes have vanished from episodes they remember differently. The unaired rough pilot of Family Guy represents another form of suppressed content, though in this case, the suppression was about quality control rather than controversy. The rough pilot was a work-in-progress version of the show that predated the finished first episode. It featured different animation, quality, and slightly different character designs from what eventually aired. This pilot was considered lost for over 2 decades before it leaked online in 2025. The leak gave fans their first look at what Family Guy looked like before MacFarlane and his team had fully refined the show's visual identity. The Parents Television Council, the conservative media watchdog group, waged what can only be described as a sustained campaign against Family Guy throughout the show's history. The PTC labelled Family Guy the worst TV show of the week on at least 40 separate occasions, which means they gave that designation to the same show more times than most shows receive any kind of review at all. The organisation frequently filed FCC complaints targeting the show's humour about race, religion, domestic violence, and statutory rape. They described the show's content as lewd sexual content and called it a corrupting influence on American culture. The PTC's campaign against Family Guy reflected a broader tension between animated comedy aimed at adults and advocacy groups that viewed any animated content as inherently accessible to children, regardless of its time slot or content rating. Family Guy aired in late night and primetime slots with appropriate content advisories, but the PTC argued that animation itself signalled children's programming and that parents couldn't be expected to monitor what their kids watched at all hours. Several legal battles further tested the boundaries of what Family Guy could do under the protection of parody and satire. Carol Burnett filed a lawsuit against the show over a parody character that appeared in an episode. The judge dismissed the case under First Amendment protections, ruling that the use fell within the legal definition of parody. Art Matrano, a comedian and actor, sued over a parody of his magic act that appeared in the straight-to-DVD film Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story. That case was also dismissed under fair use principles. These legal victories established important precedents for animated parody in American television. They confirmed that animated shows could reference, mock, and satirize real people and their work without crossing the line into actionable infringement, provided the use served a parodic purpose rather than simply copying the original material for commercial gain. The international censorship landscape for Family Guy varies dramatically depending on the country. In some nations, the show airs with minimal editing. In others, episodes are heavily modified to comply with local broadcast standards. In a few cases, the show has been banned entirely. Venezuela banned a specific episode that dealt with cannabis, reflecting the country's stricter approach to drug-related content in media. Various Middle Eastern countries have restricted or banned the show due to its treatment of religion, sexuality, and political topics that conflict with state and cultural norms. Australian censors have edited episodes to remove content violating local broadcast standards, creating versions that differ significantly from American broadcasts. The show's content rating itself reflects the ongoing tension between its adult-oriented humor and the broadcast standards that govern American television. On Fox, Family Guy carries a TV-14 rating with DLSV descriptors indicating dialogue, language, sex and violence. However, on Disney+, the same show carries a TVMA rating, the most restrictive category available. This discrepancy means that the same content is classified differently depending on which platform you watch it on, creating a situation where viewers using one service see a show rated for teenagers, while viewers on another service see a show rated exclusively for adults. The DVD releases typically contain uncut versions of episodes with stronger content than what aired on broadcast television. The pattern that emerges from examining Family Guy's censorship history is one of constantly shifting boundaries. What was considered too controversial for broadcast in 2001 might air without incident in 2015. What was acceptable in 2010 might be quietly edited out of streaming versions in 2023. The show exists in a perpetual negotiation between the creators, who want to push boundaries, the networks and platforms that want to avoid controversy, the advocacy groups that want to restrict content they find objectionable, and the legal system that determines where the line between protected speech and actionable offence actually falls. The banned episodes themselves have taken on a mythological quality within the Family Guy fan community, similar to how South Park's banned Muhammad episodes became objects of fascination precisely because they were forbidden. Partial terms of endearment generates discussion every time a fan discovers that a major animated comedy produced an episode that their network refused to air. Turban Cowboy raises questions about the relationship between satire and real-world tragedy. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein illustrates how the same content can be banned in one market, broadcast freely in another, and challenged legally in a third. Family Guy's most significant censorship controversies include partial terms of endearment from Season 8, which addressed abortion and was refused by Fox for United States broadcast, only airing on the BBC internationally and remaining absent from all American streaming platforms to this day. Turban Cowboy from Season 11 was pulled from Hulu and Fox.com in April 2013 after the Boston Marathon bombings, when a hoax clip combined a marathon cutaway gag with a separate explosion joke to create the false impression that the show had predicted the attack. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein from Season 3 had a complex release history, first airing on Adult Swim on November 9th, 2003, then on Fox on December 10th, 2004, while being reportedly banned in Canada on Teletoon and triggering a copyright lawsuit from Born Company music publishers over the parody song I Need a Jew. An unaired rough pilot was considered lost until it leaked online in 2025. The Parents Television Council labelled Family Guy the worst TV show of the week on at least 40 occasions and filed numerous FCC complaints. Carol Burnett and Art Matrano both filed lawsuits against the show that were dismissed under First Amendment and fair use protections. The show carries different content ratings on different platforms, with TV-14 on Fox and TVMA on Disney Plus for the same content. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the death stunts and fan revolts that nearly tore the show apart. On the evening of November 24th, 2013, millions of Family Guy fans sat down to watch what they assumed would be a typical episode of the show they'd been following for over a decade. The episode was called Life of Brian, and it was the 6th episode of the 12th season. Nobody knew it at the time, but this single half hour of animated television was about to generate more public outrage, more online petitions, and more mainstream news coverage than almost anything Family Guy had ever done. The episode opened with a storyline involving Stewie and Brian using the time machine that Stewie had built. The two travelled back to Jamestown, Virginia, where a previous adventure had inadvertently given guns to Native Americans, resulting in an alternate timeline where Europeans never colonized America. After resolving this timeline issue and returning to the present, Stewie made a decision that would set up the episode's devastating twist. He destroyed the time machine. The device had gotten them into too much trouble, he reasoned. It was too dangerous to keep around, so he dismantled it. With the time machine gone, the episode shifted to a seemingly mundane domestic scene. Brian and Stewie were playing on the street outside the Griffin house. Brian went to retrieve a hockey net from the road, and a car, moving too fast to stop, struck Brian directly. The scene was not played for laughs. There was no cutaway gag, no absurd punchline. Brian lay in the street badly injured and was rushed to the veterinary hospital. The family gathered around his bed as the veterinarian delivered the news that Brian's injuries were too severe to treat. He was going to die. In his final moments, Brian looked at the family he had lived with for over 200 episodes and said his last words, "You've given me a wonderful life. I love you all." Brian Griffin, the martini-drinking, Prius-driving, novel-writing, existentially tortured talking dog who had been a central character since the pilot episode in 1999, was dead. The Griffin family held a funeral. Peter stood at the graveside and said that Brian wasn't just his dog, he was his best friend in the whole world. The family mourned, and then, 1 month later in the episode's timeline, Lois suggested they get a new dog to help them heal. Peter visited a pet shop and chose Vinny, a smooth-talking Italian dog voiced by Tony Sirico, the actor best known for playing Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos. The reaction from fans was volcanic. Within hours of the episode's broadcast, which fell on Thanksgiving weekend, the internet erupted with grief, rage, and disbelief. The hashtag #BringBackBrian began trending on Twitter within the first hour after the episode ended, accumulating over 6,000 mentions in 60 minutes. A separate hashtag, #RIPBrian, spread simultaneously as fans processed what they'd just witnessed. The most consequential response came from a Family Guy fan named Aaron Thompson, who lived in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Early on the morning of November 25th, less than 24 hours after the episode aired, Thompson created a petition on change.org titled Seth MacFarlane and Fox Broadcasting Company. Bring Brian Griffin back to Family Guy. The petition's text read that Brian Griffin was an important part of our viewing experience and that Family Guy and Fox Broadcasting would lose viewers if Brian Griffin was not brought back to the show. The petition spread at a speed that caught everyone off guard. Within the first 72 hours, it had accumulated over 100,000 signatures. Thompson had tapped into something that went beyond normal fan disappointment. People weren't just annoyed that a character they liked had been written off the show. They were genuinely upset. The comment sections on the petition and on social media were filled with emotional responses from viewers who described Brian as a member of their family, as a character they had grown up watching, as a voice they associated with comfort and routine. A Facebook page titled RIP Brian Griffin from Family Guy launched the same day and attracted over 758,000 likes in a matter of days. Someone created a website called briansannouncement.com that featured a countdown clock scheduled to reach 0 in 10 days, leading fans to speculate that Brian's return was imminent. Fox quickly issued a statement clarifying that the website was a hoax and had not been created by anyone connected to the show, studio, or network. Major news organizations picked up the story with an intensity that nobody expected for the death of an animated dog. CNN, CBS, The Huffington Post, The International Business Times, TMZ, The Independent, and dozens of other outlets all ran stories about Brian's death and the fan backlash. The coverage treated the event not as a trivial pop culture moment, but as a genuine news story about the relationship between creators, audiences, and the characters they share. Executive producer Steve Callahan gave an interview to E! Online, explaining the creative reasoning behind the decision. He said the idea had been pitched in the writer's room and caught fire. They thought it could be a fun way to shake things up. He explained that killing Brian rather than one of the human characters felt more realistic because, as he put it, it seemed more in the realm of reality that a dog would get hit by a car than if one of the kids died. When asked if he was worried about the backlash, Callahan said he wasn't, because the show's fans were smart enough and loyal enough to trust the creative team. That confidence may have been slightly misplaced, given the scale of the reaction. Seth MacFarlane himself weighed in on the situation during a press tour for another project, the science documentary series Cosmos, A Space-Time Odyssey. He told interviewers that every question he received was about Brian's death rather than about Cosmos. In a later Reddit AMA, a user asked MacFarlane directly about his reaction to the fan response. His answer was revealing. He said he was very surprised by the size of the reaction and that the positive spin was that people still really gave a damn about the character. He admitted that the writers thought it would create a little bit of a stir, but that the rage wasn't something they counted on. 3 weeks after Brian's death aired, the show broadcast an episode titled Christmas Guy. It was the 8th episode of season 12, and it aired on December 15th, 2013. In the episode, Stewie, who had been mourning Brian's loss, encounters a past version of himself at a shopping mall. This past Stewie was from a different point in the timeline and carried a functioning time machine in his backpack. Remember, the current Stewie had destroyed his own time machine in the episode where Brian died, which was why he couldn't simply go back and prevent the accident. Current-day Stewie convinced Vinny, the replacement dog, to distract past Stewie long enough for current Stewie to steal the time machine. He travelled back to the exact moment of Brian's accident and pushed him out of the path of the oncoming car. Brian was alive. The timeline had been corrected. In the reunification scene, Stewie told Brian that he couldn't live without him and had come back from the future to save his life. Brian responded with a line that functioned as both an in-universe statement and a meta-commentary on the controversy. He said, "Thank you for saving my life," and then added that a lot of other families would have just gotten a new dog and moved on. After the episode aired, MacFarlane posted a message on Twitter that confirmed what some fans had suspected all along. The death was never intended to be permanent. It was designed as a 3-episode arc exploring themes of loss and gratitude. MacFarlane's tweet read, "And thus endeth our warm, fuzzy holiday lesson. Never take those you love for granted, for they can be gone in a flash." He followed up with another tweet thanking fans for caring so much about the canine griffin and saying Brian was overcome with gratitude. The Life of Brian and Christmas Guy arc raised serious questions about how television shows handle major character events in the age of social media. In previous decades, a show could kill a character and deal with the fallout over the course of a season, allowing audiences time to process the change and potentially come to accept it. In 2013, the feedback was instantaneous, overwhelming, and inescapable. The writers had to navigate a situation where millions of people were demanding a specific outcome, while the episodes resolving the storyline were already produced and in the pipeline. The Brian death arc also illustrated the evolving relationship between creators and audiences in the streaming era. Fans didn't just express displeasure, they organised. They created petitions, launched social media campaigns, generated news coverage, and applied economic pressure by threatening to stop watching the show. Whether MacFarlane and the writers always planned to bring Brian back, or whether the intensity of the reaction influenced the timeline of his return, remains a subject of debate among fans. The broader impact of the Life of Brian controversy extended beyond Family Guy itself. It demonstrated that animated characters could generate the same emotional attachment and protective instinct from audiences that live-action characters produced. The death of Brian Griffin was treated by many fans with the same seriousness as the death of a character on a prestige drama. The petition, the trending hashtags, and the news coverage all reflected a cultural moment where the boundaries between animated and live-action storytelling had blurred to the point of irrelevance. Beyond Brian's death, Family Guy has used character mortality and mortality fake-outs as storytelling devices throughout its run. The Season 6 two-part episode arc involved Stewie successfully simulating the murder of Lois and briefly taking over the world before the plot was revealed as a simulation. The Season 9 premiere, And Then There Were Fewer, was a murder mystery set at James Woods' mansion, where news anchor Diane Simmons killed multiple recurring characters over the course of a single episode. These death events served different narrative purposes, from dark comedy to genuine thriller plotting, but none generated the level of public response that Brian's death produced. The show's willingness to kill, revive, and manipulate the mortality of its characters connects to a broader pattern in long-running animated comedies. South Park famously killed Kenny McCormick in nearly every episode for its first 5 seasons before making his death permanent in Season 6 and then bringing him back in Season 7. The Simpsons has avoided permanent character deaths almost entirely, treating its cast as immortal within the show's floating timeline. Family Guy's approach falls somewhere between these extremes, treating death as a serious event when the story calls for it, while maintaining the flexibility to reverse it through science fiction devices when necessary. The Writers Guild of America strikes that bookended this era of Family Guy created their own disruptions and controversies. The 2007 to 2008 WGA strike halted production across the entertainment industry, and Family Guy was not immune. What made the situation unusual was Fox's response to the production gap. Rather than simply not airing episodes during the strike, Fox broadcast 3 episodes that had not received MacFarlane's final approval or voice mixing. These were essentially incomplete episodes that went to air against the creator's wishes. MacFarlane publicly condemned this decision, describing it as damaging to his relationship with the network. The situation revealed the tension between a creator's artistic control over their work and a network's economic incentive to fill airtime with available content regardless of quality. Fox owned the episodes as part of its deal with MacFarlane's production company and legally had the right to air them. But airing material that the creator had not signed off on violated the trust that the creative partnership depended on. History repeated itself during the 2023 WGA strike, when MacFarlane and the show's other showrunners walked off production on May 12, 2023. This time, the shutdown was clean, with no incomplete episodes airing during the work stoppage. The 2023 strike ultimately resulted in improved compensation and working conditions for writers across the industry, though the specific impact on Family Guy's production pipeline was relatively minor compared to shows with shorter histories and less established production rhythms. The COVID-19 pandemic created a different kind of production challenge in 2020. The shift to remote work disrupted the animation pipeline that Family Guy depended on. Voice recording, which normally occurred in professional studios with actors in the same room, had to be adapted for home recording setups. The animation workflow, which involved coordination between the Los Angeles-based production team and international animation studios, was complicated by travel restrictions and facility closures. The pandemic forced an 8-week production and broadcast hiatus, with the show returning with new episodes on April 19, 2020. During the pandemic, the production team demonstrated creative flexibility by releasing a 3-minute educational PSA, short explaining the science behind COVID vaccines, featuring Peter, Stewie, and Brian. This short represented an unusual use of the show's characters for public health messaging rather than entertainment, reflecting the unique cultural position that Family Guy occupied as a show with enough visibility to reach audiences that traditional public health communications might not. Brian's death in the November 24th, 2013 episode. Life of Brian generated unprecedented fan backlash. Brian was struck by a car and killed, with his final words being a declaration of love for the Griffin family. Within hours, Aaron Thompson of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, launched a Change.org petition that accumulated over 100,000 signatures in 72 hours. The hashtag #BringBackBrian received over 6,000 Twitter mentions in its first hour. A Facebook memorial page gained over 758,000 likes. Executive producer Steve Callahan told E! The decision was meant to shake things up, while MacFarlane later admitted on Reddit that the rage was something they never counted on. Brian was resurrected 3 weeks later in the December 15th, 2013 episode Christmas Guy, when Stewie stole a time machine from his past self to prevent the accident. MacFarlane confirmed the death was always planned as a temporary 3-episode arc about loss and gratitude. The 2007 to 2008 WGA strike caused Fox to air 3 incomplete episodes without MacFarlane's approval, which he publicly condemned. The 2023 WGA strike resulted in a clean production shutdown starting May 12, 2023. The COVID-19 pandemic forced an 8-week production hiatus in 2020, with the show returning April 19, 2020, and the team releasing a vaccine PSA short featuring Peter, Stewie, and Brian. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the franchise experiments that try to turn Family Guy into something much bigger than a television show. Family Guy started as one television show on one network, with one creator drawing characters in his kitchen. By the mid-2000s, it had become the anchor of a multimedia franchise that included spin-off series, feature-length specials, Star Wars parody films, video games, a straight-to-DVD movie, and a streaming deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The expansion wasn't always successful. Some of these ventures produced genuinely excellent work that stands alongside the best episodes of the original series. Others revealed the limitations of trying to stretch a sitcom premise across formats it was never designed for. But taken together, they tell the story of how a show that was cancelled twice became a property valuable enough to anchor an entire network's animation strategy. The Star Wars parody trilogy represents Family Guy's most ambitious, creative experiment, and by most critical measures, its most successful expansion beyond the standard episode format. The first installment, called Blue Harvest, aired as the Season 6 premiere on September 23, 2007. It was an hour-long, shot-for-shot parody of the original 1977 Star Wars film, produced under a formal licensing agreement with Lucasfilm. That licensing deal was significant because it meant Family Guy wasn't simply making unlicensed references to Star Wars, which the show had done plenty of times before. Lucasfilm actually granted permission for the parody, allowing MacFarlane and his team to use the film's actual plot structure, iconic scenes, and character designs as the framework for their comedy. Blue Harvest cast Peter as Han Solo, Lois as Princess Leia, Stewie as Darth Vader, Brian as Chewbacca, Chris as Luke Skywalker, Cleveland as R2-D2, Quagmire as C-3PO, and various other Family Guy characters in corresponding Star Wars roles. The episode balanced faithful recreation of the original film's iconic moments with Family Guy's signature cutaway humour and pop culture commentary. The visual ambition was remarkable for a television animation production, with sequences that closely replicated the space battles, lightsaber duels, and environmental designs of the original film while maintaining Family Guy's distinctive animation style. Blue Harvest won the Saturn Award for Best Television Presentation in 2008, validating the experiment as something more than a gimmick. The critical and audience reception encouraged the production of 2 sequels, Something, Something, Something. Darkside aired as part of Season 8 and parodied The Empire Strikes Back. It's a Trap, which covered Return of the Jedi. aired during Season 9. All 3 episodes were collected and released together as Laugh It Up Fuzzball, the Family Guy trilogy on DVD, creating a standalone home media product that could be marketed to both Family Guy fans and Star Wars fans simultaneously. The trilogy demonstrated MacFarlane's genuine love of the Star Wars franchise. These weren't lazy parodies that mocked the source material from a position of contempt. They were clearly made by people who had grown up watching the original films and understood them deeply enough to know exactly which moments to recreate faithfully and which to subvert for comedy. The loving attention to visual detail suggested a production team that cared about getting the Star Wars elements right even as they were embedding fart jokes and non sequiturs throughout the narrative. Before the Star Wars trilogy, Family Guy had already experimented with the feature-length format through Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, a straight-to-DVD movie released in 2005. The timing of this release was strategically important. It came during the gap between the show's cancellation and its revival on Fox, serving as a way to maintain fan engagement and generate revenue during a period when no new episodes were airing on broadcast television. The film was subsequently divided into 3 episodes and aired as part of Season 4 after the show's return, with the segments titled Stewie Be Good, Bango Was His Name, Oh, and Stu and Stewie's Excellent Adventure. The Untold Story focused on Stewie's character in ways that the regular series format didn't always allow. The film explored themes of identity and destiny by having Stewie travel to the future and encounter his adult self, who had grown up to be a disappointed, sexually confused office worker rather than the world-conquering supervillain that infant Stewie imagined becoming. The direct-to-DVD format allowed for content that was more explicit and thematically ambitious than what Fox's broadcast standards permitted, including Stewie's sexuality being addressed more directly than the series typically attempted. The Simpsons crossover episode, titled The Simpsons Guy, aired as the Season 13 premiere on September 28, 2014. The 44-minute special brought together the 2 most prominent animated families in American television history for the first time in an official capacity. The Griffins drove to Springfield after fleeing Quahog, encountering the Simpson family and discovering parallels between their respective worlds. The episode was written by Patrick Mahan and directed by Peter Shin, 2 of Family Guy's most experienced creative contributors. The crossover culminated in an extended brawl between Homer Simpson and Peter Griffin that destroyed much of Springfield. The fight sequence lasted several minutes and included increasingly absurd escalations that drew from both shows' arsenals of physical comedy. The episode worked as a piece of fan service, delivering the matchup that viewers had speculated about for years. However, it also highlighted the fundamental differences between the 2 shows' approaches to comedy. The Simpsons sections felt warmer and more character-driven, while the Family Guy sections relied more heavily on shock humour and non-sequitur gags. The Cleveland show, which ran from 2009 to 2013, represents Family Guy's only spin-off series and its most significant expansion into ongoing programming beyond the original show. Created by Seth MacFarlane, Richard Appel, and Mike Henry, the Cleveland show followed Cleveland Brown as he moved from Quahog to Stool Bend, Virginia, where he reunited with his high school crush, Donna Tubbs, and became part of a blended family. The show ran for 4 seasons and produced 88 episodes on Fox before being cancelled. The Cleveland show's creation required temporarily removing Cleveland from the Family Guy cast, which affected the dynamic of Peter's friend group at the Drunken Clam. When the spin-off was cancelled, Cleveland and his new family were reintegrated into Family Guy, starting with Season 12, restoring the original character configuration. The spin-off is generally regarded as the weakest entry in MacFarlane's animated television universe, which also includes American Dad. Critics and fans often noted that Cleveland, while a reliable supporting character on Family Guy, didn't possess the depth or complexity needed to anchor his own series. The video game adaptations of Family Guy followed a trajectory that never achieved the same level of quality as the television series. Family Guy video game was released in 2006 during the show's post-revival peak popularity. It was a standard licensed game product that attempted to translate the show's humour into interactive form, but received mediocre reviews. Family Guy: Back to the Multiverse arrived in 2012 and fared slightly better, drawing on the popular multiverse concept to create varied gameplay environments. However, neither game achieved the critical breakthrough that South Park's The Stick of Truth would accomplish in 2014 by proving that an animated comedy could produce a genuinely excellent video game when the creators were deeply involved in the development process. Family Guy never got its Stick of Truth moment, and the gaming side of the franchise remained a commercial afterthought rather than a creative triumph. The music of Family Guy deserves extended discussion because it represents one of the show's most distinctive and underappreciated creative achievements. Walter Murphy, who composed the theme song and served as the primary musical scorer for all seasons, approached the show's music with a level of sophistication that seems wildly disproportionate to the content it accompanies. Murphy utilized a full orchestra, arranging the scores with big band swing and Broadway aesthetics that treated the dysfunctional storylines with sincere cinematic gravity. The musical dissonance between the elaborate orchestral arrangements and the crude on-screen humor became one of Family Guy's most effective comedic tools. Scenes of Peter doing something grotesque are scored with the kind of sweeping orchestral music that you'd expect in a prestige drama, and the contrast makes both the music and the comedy funnier. Ron Jones served as co-composer for seasons 1 through 12, contributing additional orchestral work that expanded the show's musical palette. La La Land Records released an orchestral score album that highlighted the complex jazz and big band compositions created by Murphy and Jones, treating the television score as legitimate standalone music worthy of album release. Family Guy's musical numbers within the show itself became signature moments that fans would share and revisit independent of the episodes they appeared in. Songs like You Have AIDS, Shipoopy, and Prom Night Dumpster Baby achieved cultural penetration that extended well beyond the show's regular audience. A 25th anniversary EP containing several of the show's most popular musical numbers was released digitally in 2024, acknowledging the song's status as standalone cultural artifacts. In 2009, a special live performance show called Family Guy Presents Seth and Alex's Almost Live comedy show aired on television, featuring MacFarlane and Alex Borstein performing songs from the show, as well as new parody material. The special demonstrated that Family Guy's musical elements had enough appeal to support a live performance format, something that few animated comedies could claim. The Paramount Plus streaming deal, while technically a deal involving the broader Family Guy and South Park properties under the Viacom-CBS umbrella, represented the most significant business expansion in Family Guy's history. But more directly relevant to Family Guy was the broader trend of the show becoming a streaming powerhouse. While linear television ratings declined to below 2 million viewers per episode in recent seasons, Family Guy's streaming numbers told a completely different story. The show ranked as the 4th most streamed television show across all digital platforms in the first half of 2025. On Hulu, where the show has been exclusively available for US streaming, Family Guy has consistently ranked at or near the top of the platform's most watched shows for multiple years running. This streaming dominance proved that Family Guy's audience hadn't disappeared, it had migrated. The viewers who once tuned in on Sunday nights to watch the show on Fox were now watching on their own schedules through Hulu and Disney+. The shift validated the show's continued production even as traditional ratings suggested declining interest. Networks and studios had learned from the DVD revolution that brought Family Guy back from cancellation. Viewership metrics that don't capture actual audience size can be misleading. The DVD sales proved it in 2003. The streaming numbers proved it again 20 years later. In April 2025, a massive multi-season renewal deal was announced that extended Family Guy through season 28, securing the show's future through at least 2028 or 2029. This deal reflected confidence in the franchise's long-term value based on its streaming performance rather than its broadcast ratings. The show had demonstrated that it could generate subscriber retention for streaming platforms, which in the current media landscape is more valuable than live viewership numbers. The merchandising side of the franchise has generated substantial revenue across diverse product categories since the show's debut. Early merchandise included t-shirts, plush toys, action figures, and accessories featuring the Griffin family and their catchphrases. The simple character designs translated well to merchandise, making the characters easily recognizable and reproducible across different product formats. DVD sales were particularly significant, as we discussed earlier, with the first and second season box sets selling 2.2 million copies and becoming the best-selling television DVD of 2003. The 25th anniversary in 2024 prompted a wave of commemorative merchandise and media releases, including the digital EP mentioned earlier. The anniversary also coincided with new syndication deals that expanded the show's broadcast presence. A Comedy Central licensing deal was announced on August 14, 2024, with broadcasts beginning September 2nd, 2024. Adult Swim, the cable block that had played such a crucial role in the show's revival in 2003, announced a return deal in 2025. Holiday specials on Hulu have become a new distribution model for the franchise in recent years. The show's first Hulu special premiered on October 14, 2024, followed by a Christmas special titled Gift of the White Guy set for November 25, 2024. A Halloween special for the season 24 era aired on Hulu on October 6, 2025. These specials allow the franchise to maintain audience engagement between regular broadcast seasons while providing exclusive content that gives Hulu subscribers a reason to stay subscribed. The franchise expansion also influenced how MacFarlane approached his own career beyond Family Guy. The success of the show gave him the platform to create American Dad, which premiered in 2005 and developed his own cult following. He directed the feature films Ted and Ted 2, both live-action comedies featuring a talking teddy bear that drew directly from the irreverent humour that defined Family Guy. He created the science fiction series The Orville, which allowed him to explore his love of Star Trek in a format that balanced comedy with genuine science fiction storytelling. He released multiple Grammy-nominated albums of great American songbook standards, performing live at the Hollywood Bowl, Carnegie Hall, and the Royal Albert Hall. He hosted the Academy Awards in 2013. Without Family Guy's success creating the foundation for all of these ventures, none of them would have been possible. The expansion of Family Guy across multiple media formats and business models reveals the underlying strengths of the property beyond its reputation for crude humour. The franchise possesses strong characters with instantly recognisable voices and visual designs. It has a flexible satirical framework that can accommodate virtually any subject matter, and it has a creator whose multifaceted talents allowed the property to extend into areas that most animated comedies never approach, from orchestral music to live-action filmmaking to theatrical vocal performances. Family Guy's Star Wars parody trilogy began with Blue Harvest on September 23, 2007, an hour-long shot-for-shot parody of the original film produced under a licensing agreement with Lucasfilm that won the Saturn Award for Best Television Presentation in 2008. The trilogy continued with Something 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 Dark Side, covering The Empire Strikes Back, and It's a Trap covering Return of the Jedi. Released together as Laugh It Up Fuzzball, the Family Guy trilogy on DVD, Stewie Griffin: The Untold Story was released as a straight-to-DVD movie in 2005 during the cancellation gap, later serialized into 3 broadcast episodes. The Simpsons Guy crossover aired September 28, 2014 as a 44-minute special featuring an extended Homer versus Peter Brawl. The Cleveland Show ran from 2009 to 2013 for 4 seasons and 88 episodes, before Cleveland returned to Family Guy in season 12. Video games including the 2006 Family Guy video game and 2012's Back to the Multiverse received mediocre reviews. Walter Murphy composed the orchestral score for all seasons using a full orchestra with big band and Broadway arrangements. With Ron Jones co-composing through season 12, the show ranked 4th most streamed across all platforms in the first half of 2025 and has consistently topped Hulu's viewership charts. An April 2025 deal renewed the show through season 28. A Comedy Central syndication deal was announced August 14, 2024, with Adult Swim returning in 2025. Hulu holiday specials began with an October 14, 2024 premiere, establishing a new distribution model for the franchise. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to why Family Guy works as bedtime listening and the strange psychology of falling asleep to a show that was designed to shock you. There's something that happens to every long-running animated show, and it's the slow, quiet transformation of characters that the audience barely notices until someone points it out. Family Guy has undergone some of the most dramatic character evolutions in animation history, and most of them happen so gradually that fans only recognize them in retrospect. Take Stewie Griffin. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Stewie was a one-dimensional villain. His entire character was built around 2 obsessions: killing his mother Lois and achieving world domination. He built weapons, he plotted assassinations, he delivered monologues about his plans for global conquest that were funny precisely because they came from an infant who still wore a diaper. The comedy was in the contrast between his appearance and his ambitions. He looked like a baby. He sounded like Rex Harrison, and he wanted to enslave humanity. After the show's revival in 2005, Stewie began transforming into a completely different character. The world domination plots faded. The attempts to kill Lois became less frequent and eventually disappeared almost entirely. In their place, Stewie evolved into something far more complex. He became the show's most emotionally nuanced character, capable of genuine vulnerability, intellectual curiosity, and a depth of feeling that none of the adult characters could match. His relationship with Brian became the emotional core of the series, producing the road to episodes that many fans consider the best content Family Guy has ever produced. The road to episodes inspired by the Bob Hope and Bing Crosby. Road to comedy films of the 1940s and 1950s paired Brian and Stewie on adventures that took them far from Quahog. Road to Rhode Island aired in Season 2, Road to Europe came in Season 3, Road to the Multiverse opened Season 8, Road to the North Pole closed out Season 9. Each installment deepened the relationship between the intellectual dog and the increasingly sensitive infant, creating a partnership dynamic that gave Family Guy something it had never really had before: emotional stakes. Stewie's sexuality became an increasingly prominent element of his character across the post-revival seasons. Early seasons had hinted at Stewie being gay through occasional jokes and ambiguous situations, but the show treated these hints as throwaway gags rather than genuine character development. Later seasons addressed the question more directly, depicting Stewie in situations that explored his attraction to men while maintaining enough ambiguity that the show could play the revelation for comedy or sincerity, depending on what any given episode required. The season 16 episode titled Send in Stewie, Please was one of the most unusual episodes in Family Guy's history. The entire episode consisted of Stewie having a therapy session with a child psychologist, voiced by Ian McKellen. The episode dropped the cutaway gags, the slapstick humour, and the multi-character ensemble format entirely, presenting instead a single sustained conversation between two characters in one room. Stewie discussed his relationship with his mother, his feelings about his own identity, and his struggle to understand who he was becoming. The episode was a dramatic departure from everything Family Guy was known for, and it demonstrated that the character MacFarlane had created as a one-note villain in 1999 had evolved into someone capable of carrying a half-hour of nuanced psychological drama. Peter Griffin underwent his own transformation, though his was less intentional and more controversial. In the early seasons, Peter was dim but not stupid. He was a working-class guy who made poor decisions based on impulse rather than malice. He loved his family even when his behaviour caused them harm. He was, in many ways, a more sympathetic version of Homer Simpson, sharing Homer's appetite for food, beer, and television, while possessing a somewhat warmer relationship with his wife and children. Over time, Peter's intelligence dropped. His behaviour became more erratic, and his decision-making shifted from merely impulsive to genuinely detached from reality. Where early Peter might have accidentally caused a problem by being careless, later Peter would cause disasters through actions that no functioning adult would consider. The show's writers began treating Peter less as a character and more as a vehicle for increasingly extreme gags, pushing his stupidity to levels that strained even the generous suspension of disbelief that animated comedy allows. This phenomenon, which fans have called Flanderization after the similar progression of Ned Flanders on The Simpsons, affected other Family Guy characters as well. Quagmire's sexual behaviour escalated from merely promiscuous to genuinely predatory. Meg's treatment by her family evolved from occasional teasing to sustained psychological abuse that some episodes played for laughs, and others seemed to recognise as genuinely disturbing. Joe Swanson's emotional fragility increased to the point where his disability became the defining trait of his character, rather than one element of a more complex personality. The cutaway gag format itself underwent evolution across the show's run. In the early seasons, cutaways were relatively brief and served as punctuation for longer scenes. A character would reference something, the show would cut to a quick visual joke, illustrating the reference, and then the action would return to the main storyline. These early cutaways lasted a few seconds and were deployed strategically to maintain the show's pacing. Later seasons expanded the cutaway format considerably. Individual gags grew longer, sometimes occupying 30 seconds or more. Episodes began stringing multiple cutaways together in rapid succession, creating sequences where the main storyline disappeared entirely behind a wall of tangentially related jokes. Some fans embraced this evolution as the show leaning into what made it unique. Others argued that the expanding cutaways represented a creative crutch, a way for writers to fill time without developing the storylines and character interactions that had grounded the show's earlier seasons. The cutaway format also created a distinctive watching experience that set Family Guy apart from every other animated comedy on television. Shows like The Simpsons and South Park told stories with clear narrative arcs, character motivations, and plot structures that audiences could follow from beginning to end. Family Guy episodes sometimes felt less like stories and more like collections of jokes loosely organised around a premise. You could walk into the room during the middle of a Family Guy episode and understand what was happening within seconds, because the cutaway format meant that context from earlier in the episode was rarely necessary to appreciate what was on screen at any given moment. This structural approach had unexpected consequences for how audiences consumed the show. Family Guy became ideal for short-form viewing long before platforms like TikTok made short-form video the dominant mode of content consumption. individual cutaway gags were perfectly sized for sharing on early social media platforms. Fans would upload their favourite gags to YouTube as standalone clips, creating a secondary distribution network for the show's content that existed entirely outside of Fox's control. Many people who have never sat through an entire episode of Family Guy can quote specific cutaway gags because they encountered them as isolated clips online. The relationship between Family Guy and The Simpsons represents one of the longest-running rivalries in animation history, and it's worth exploring because the dynamics of that rivalry reveal important things about both shows. The Simpsons debuted in 1989, a full decade before Family Guy, and was the dominant animated comedy in American television for years before MacFarlane's show arrived. When Family Guy premiered in 1999, many critics immediately noted similarities between the two shows. Both featured bumbling blue-collar fathers, their more sensible wives, and their quirky children living in fictional American towns. The comparison was inevitable, and Simpsons fans in particular were hostile to what they viewed as an imitator. The rivalry played out through digs embedded within both shows. The Simpsons took shots at Family Guy's reliance on cutaway gags and its perceived lack of narrative structure. Family Guy responded with jokes about The Simpsons' declining quality in later seasons and its status as an aging institution. The rivalry was mostly good-natured, though it occasionally sharpened into genuine criticism. The Italian Simpsons parody bot, which created random Simpsons quotes by combining elements from different episodes, was sometimes used by fans to argue that the algorithm-generated content was as coherent as actual Family Guy writing. The crossover episode in 2014 was supposed to serve as a peace treaty of sorts, bringing both families together in a way that acknowledged their similarities and differences. It succeeded commercially and as a cultural event, but it also highlighted how different the two shows' comedic approaches really were. The Simpsons operated on character-driven humour with emotional underpinnings. Family Guy operated on shock, speed, and the willingness to go places that other shows wouldn't. Putting them in the same episode made both shows feel slightly uncomfortable, like two friends from different social circles trying to find common ground at a party. South Park's relationship with Family Guy was even more antagonistic. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, devoted an entire two-part episode in 2006 called Cartoon Wars to attacking Family Guy. The episodes depicted Family Guy as a show whose humour was literally generated by a room full of manatees, randomly selecting balls, labelled with nouns, verbs, and pop culture references. The implication was that Family Guy's comedy required no human creativity or intelligence, that it was essentially random noise dressed up as jokes. MacFarlane responded to the South Park attack with relative grace, saying he was more surprised that Parker and Stone cared enough about Family Guy to devote 2 episodes to criticising it. The Cartoon Wars episodes actually boosted Family Guy's ratings by drawing attention to the show, an ironic outcome that MacFarlane probably appreciated. The cultural impact of Family Guy extends beyond entertainment into how Americans process and discuss sensitive topics through comedy. The show's willingness to make jokes about race, religion, disability, sexuality, and political controversy created a framework where viewers could engage with uncomfortable subjects through the safety of animated humour. Whether this approach represented progressive desensitization or valuable social commentary depends entirely on your perspective, and probably changes depending on which specific joke you're evaluating. The show popularized the cutaway gag format in ways that influenced an entire generation of comedy writers and performers. Before Family Guy, non sequitur humor existed in stand-up comedy and sketch shows, but no scripted series had made it the central structural element of its storytelling. After Family Guy's success, the cutaway format appeared in live-action comedies, web series, and social media content created by people who had grown up watching the show. The influence was so pervasive that many younger comedy creators used the format without even realizing where it had originated. Family Guy's relationship with internet culture is particularly significant because the show's rise to mainstream popularity coincided almost exactly with the emergence of social media and user-generated content platforms. The show premiered in 1999, the same year that Napster launched and began reshaping how people consumed media. Its revival in 2005 coincided with the rise of YouTube, which became the primary platform through which Family Guy clips reached audiences who weren't watching the broadcast episodes. By the time Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram had become dominant social platforms, Family Guy's cutaway format was perfectly adapted for the short-form, shareable content that these platforms rewarded. The show's influence on meme culture is difficult to overstate. Peter's various injuries and falls became reaction images. Stewie's theatrical expressions became response gifs. Quagmire's giggity became a universal shorthand for suggestive situations. The show's visual simplicity made it easy to screenshot, crop, and redistribute across platforms, creating a secondary life for Family Guy content that existed entirely outside of traditional television viewership. Several character details that even dedicated fans tend to overlook reveal the depth of creative thought that went into Family Guy's ensemble. Joe Swanson's disability was caused by a criminal who shot him while he was on duty as a police officer. The specifics of this origin story have been retold in multiple episodes with slightly different details, reflecting the show's general disinterest in maintaining strict continuity. What remains consistent is that Joe's paraplegia is depicted as a permanent condition that defines his daily life, while not preventing him from being an active, sometimes aggressive participant in whatever chaos Peter drags the group into. Mort Goldman, the perpetually anxious pharmacist, represents a specific strain of Jewish character comedy that the show has been both praised and criticized for. Mort's neuroses, his hypochondria, and his exaggerated reactions to minor threats draw on stereotypes that have a long and complicated history in American comedy. The character walks a fine line between affectionate caricature and problematic representation, and the show has never seemed particularly interested in resolving that tension. Herbert, the elderly neighbour with an obvious and disturbing attraction to Chris Griffin, represents one of Family Guy's most controversial recurring elements. The character's predatory behaviour toward minors is played for comedy, with the joke relying on the audience's discomfort as the primary source of humour. Herbert appears in dozens of episodes across multiple seasons, his behaviour remaining consistent and never receiving any consequences within the show's narrative. The character has drawn criticism from viewers who argue that making light of child predation normalises the behaviour, while the show's defenders contend that the humour comes from the absurdity and inappropriateness of the situation rather than from any endorsement of it. Consuela, the housekeeper character who appears in various episodes, represents the show's approach to ethnic humour through a character defined primarily by her accented English and her resistance to following instructions. The character has been cited in discussions about representation and stereotyping in animated comedy, with critics noting that her defining characteristics reduce Latina identity to an accent and a cleaning job. The evil monkey who lived in Chris's closet was a recurring visual gag for several seasons, appearing whenever Chris opened his closet door to point accusingly at Chris before the door closed again. The gag was eventually resolved when the monkey was revealed to be a misunderstood creature going through personal problems, a payoff that subverted years of built-up expectations by making the threatening figure sympathetic. James Woods, the real actor, appeared as a recurring character throughout the series. His animated counterpart became an antagonist to the Griffin family, stealing Peter's identity in one episode and being murdered and revived in others. The relationship between the show and the real James Woods became complicated as the actor's public political views shifted in directions that created tension with the show's generally liberal, creative team. James Woods Regional High School was named after the actor within the show's universe, creating a situation where a public institution bore the name of a figure who became increasingly controversial in real life. The show's treatment of Meg Griffin over the course of its run constitutes one of the most unusual character trajectories in animation. Meg began as a relatively normal teenage character who experienced the standard difficulties of adolescence. Over time, the writers transformed her into the family's designated victim, subjecting her to escalating levels of emotional abuse, physical neglect, and social humiliation that went far beyond normal sitcom family dynamics. Peter, Lois, Chris, and Stewie all participated in Meg's degradation, treating her as fundamentally unworthy of respect or affection. The Meg dynamic eventually became so extreme that it circled back around into meta-commentary. Some episodes acknowledged the cruelty directed at Meg and questioned whether the family's treatment of her was justified. Other episodes doubled down, pushing the abuse to even more extreme levels for comedic effect. The result was a character whose narrative function had evolved from normal teenager to universal punching bag, to symbol of the show's willingness to find humour in the uncomfortable grey areas between comedy and cruelty. Quagmire's character underwent perhaps the most significant moral revision of any Family Guy character. In early seasons, his hypersexual behaviour was treated as a charming eccentricity. He was the group's resident playboy, a guy who loved women perhaps too much, but whose enthusiasm was presented as basically harmless. As cultural attitudes towards sexual behaviour evolved, the show began acknowledging the darker implications of Quagmire's conduct. Episodes revealed that his sexual history included behaviours that would be classified as criminal rather than merely inappropriate. The show began using Quagmire's past as a source of darker humour that acknowledged the character's actions as problematic, while still maintaining him as a core member of the friend group. The Season 8 episode called Jerome is the new black-featured Quagmire delivering a lengthy monologue to Brian about all the reasons he disliked him. The speech listed Brian's pretentiousness, his failed writing career, his hypocrisy in claiming to be progressive while exhibiting selfish behaviour, and his tendency to pursue women who were out of his league. The monologue became one of the most widely shared scenes in Family Guy's history because it articulated criticisms of Brian that many viewers had been feeling for years. The scene was remarkable because it used one morally questionable character to call out another, creating a moment of honesty between two deeply flawed individuals that resonated with audiences precisely because neither character had the moral authority to judge the other. Lois Griffin's character evolved from the sensible, patient wife of the early seasons into someone considerably more complex and occasionally more disturbing. Later seasons revealed that Lois had a wild past that included substance abuse, criminal behaviour, and sexual history that contradicted her current persona as a suburban mother. These revelations deepened her character, while also reflecting the show's general trend toward pushing every character toward more extreme versions of themselves. The Season 7 episode, Not All Dogs. Go to Heaven featured an extended storyline about Brian's atheism, which mirrored MacFarlane's own publicly stated views. The episode depicted Brian as the only atheist in Quahog, subjected to discrimination and social ostracism for his lack of religious belief. This was one of several episodes that used Brian as a vehicle for MacFarlane's personal, philosophical perspectives, blurring the line between character and creator in ways that gave the show a personal dimension that pure comedy vehicles typically avoid. The animation evolution of Family Guy across its 27-year run tells a technical story that most viewers absorb unconsciously but never examine directly. If you pull up an episode from Season 1 and compare it to an episode from Season 23, the difference is striking, not because the show looks completely different, but because it looks almost the same while being produced through entirely different methods. The earliest episodes of Family Guy were created using traditional, two-dimensional, cell-style animation that was outsourced through Film Roman, a studio that also handled animation for The Simpsons. The aesthetic was deliberately flat, with simple character designs, minimal background detail, and movement that prioritized efficiency over fluidity. Characters existed in a world of clean lines and solid colors, occupying backgrounds that looked like they had been painted by a single artist with a limited palette. After the first production season, Family Guy took animation production away from Film Roman and began handling it through different arrangements. Sunwoo Entertainment, a South Korean animation studio, became one of the primary outsourcing partners. This is standard practice in television animation. The creative decisions, voice recording, and storyboarding happen in Los Angeles, but the labor-intensive, frame-by-frame animation work gets shipped to studios in South Korea, the Philippines, or other countries where the costs are lower and the skilled workforce is available. The transition to high-definition production in Season 9 represented the most visible technical change in the show's history. The Season 9 premiere, And Then There Were Fewer, was the first episode produced in the 16:9 widescreen format and in HD resolution. This episode was a deliberate showcase for the new production capabilities, featuring a murder mystery with complex scene compositions and lighting effects that would have been difficult to achieve in the older standard definition format. In Season 8, the production had already transitioned to Toon Boom Harmony software, which achieved crisper lines, brighter color palettes, and smoother character rigging compared to the tools used in earlier seasons. The software change allowed animators to create more detailed backgrounds and more fluid character movement while maintaining production schedules that the earlier tools couldn't support at the same quality level. The budget per episode, which has been reported at approximately $2 million, represents a significant investment for a half-hour animated comedy, but is relatively modest compared to live-action productions with similar viewership numbers. The cost covers voice recording in Los Angeles, the writing staff, the animation production pipeline that spans multiple countries, the musical scoring by Walter Murphy and his orchestra, and the post-production work that assembles all these elements into finished episodes. Production challenges have shaped the show in ways that audiences never see. The 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike disrupted production so severely that Fox aired 3 episodes without MacFarlane's final approval. The 2020 COVID-19 pandemic forced an 8-week hiatus and required the entire production to adapt to remote work. Voice actors recorded from home studios rather than gathering in professional recording spaces. The animation pipeline had to accommodate the reality that coordinating between Los Angeles and international studios was more complicated when nobody could travel or meet in person. The show's production speed has never matched the extraordinary turnaround that South Park achieved with its 6-day-to-air pipeline. Family Guy's more traditional animation style requires longer production lead times, with episodes typically being completed months before their broadcast dates. This means Family Guy has never been able to respond to current events with the kind of immediacy that South Park became famous for. An event that happens in January might not be referenced in a Family Guy episode until the following season, by which point the cultural conversation has usually moved on. This production timeline also means that Family Guy episodes exist in a strange temporal relationship with the world they satirize. Jokes written 6 months before broadcast sometimes land perfectly because the subject remains relevant. Other times they feel dated because the cultural moment has passed. The writers have developed strategies for dealing with this lag, including focusing on topics with longer cultural shelf lives rather than trending news stories, and avoiding specific references that might feel outdated by the time the episode airs. The voice recording process is one of the few aspects of production that has remained relatively consistent throughout the show's history. MacFarlane and the other voice actors gather in recording studios to perform their lines, typically recording all of the dialogue for an episode in a single session. MacFarlane's ability to voice multiple characters means that some scenes involve him having conversations with himself, switching between Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire within the same recording take. The musical recording process is equally meticulous. Walter Murphy's orchestral scores are recorded by actual musicians playing actual instruments, not synthesized or digitally generated. This commitment to live orchestral recording gives Family Guy a sonic quality that distinguishes it from most other animated comedies, which rely more heavily on electronic scoring and pre-recorded music libraries. The attention to audio quality extends to the show's sound design, where effects are layered carefully to create environments that feel more detailed than the relatively simple visuals would suggest. Footsteps, door slams, ambient background noise, and the specific sounds associated with the recurring gags all receive careful attention from sound designers who understand that audio cues are critical for comedy timing. Now there are also the forgotten controversies and storylines that shaped how the show evolved, but that have largely fallen out of public discussion. The show's treatment of race has been one of its most persistent sources of controversy, and the specific incidents reveal how cultural attitudes have shifted across the show's run. In the early seasons, racial humour was deployed broadly and with relatively little consequence. Characters of various ethnicities were depicted in ways that relied on stereotypes for comedic effect, and the show's defense was always that it satirized everyone equally. White characters were depicted as idiots. Black characters were depicted through cultural stereotypes. Asian characters were depicted through accent-based humor. The show's creators argued that treating every group the same way, even if that treatment relied on stereotypes, represented a form of equality that was actually more respectful than the careful, sanitized approach that other shows took. This defense became harder to sustain as cultural conversations about representation evolved. The Cleveland Brown recast in 2020, when Mike Henry stepped down so that a black actor could voice the character, represented a concrete response to criticism that had been building for years. The show's ongoing use of characters like Consuela and Tricia Takanawa, who are defined primarily by their ethnicities and accents, continues to generate discussion about where the line falls between satirizing stereotypes and reinforcing them. The Parents Television Council's decades-long campaign against the show reflected a conservative cultural perspective that viewed Family Guy as a threat to traditional values. The PTC's 40-plus designations of Family Guy as the worst show on television, its frequent FCC complaints, and its public lobbying against the show's advertisers created a persistent oppositional pressure that likely influenced some of the censorship decisions that networks made about specific episodes and scenes. Whether the PTC's campaign actually reduced the show's viewership is debatable. There's a reasonable argument that the constant attention from conservative watchdog groups actually increased the show's appeal among younger viewers who valued rebelliousness and countercultural status. The relationship between Family Guy and the FCC itself has been characterized by an ongoing negotiation about what broadcast standards actually mean in the context of animated comedy. The show has received numerous FCC complaints, but has rarely faced formal regulatory action, partly because the FCC's enforcement powers over cable and broadcast content have been limited by legal precedent, and partly because the show airs during time periods when younger viewers are less likely to be watching. The show's treatment of disability through the character of Joe Swanson has generated its own distinct conversation. Joe is depicted as a capable, sometimes aggressive police officer who happens to use a wheelchair. His disability is neither ignored nor treated as his defining characteristic in most episodes. However, certain jokes and storylines have pushed Joe's disability into territory that advocacy groups have criticized as insensitive or reductive. The season 10 episode, Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, featured a domestic violence storyline that departed dramatically from the show's usual comedic tone. The episode depicted Quagmire's sister Brenda in an abusive relationship, and the plot treated the situation with a degree of seriousness that surprised viewers accustomed to Family Guy's irreverent approach to sensitive topics. The episode generated polarized reactions, with some viewers praising the show for addressing domestic violence in a way that might reach audiences who wouldn't encounter the topic through traditional public service channels, while others argued that the show's general comedic context undermined the seriousness of the message. The show's exploration of religious themes has been extensive and reflects MacFarlane's own atheism. Episodes have satirized Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Mormonism, and organized religion in general, treating religious belief as fair game for the same irreverent humor that the show applies to every other aspect of American culture. Jesus Christ has appeared as a character in multiple episodes, depicted variously as a normal guy dealing with the pressures of divine expectations, a party animal, and a frustrated deity who can't understand why humans insist on being terrible to each other. The treatment of religious content has generated predictable pushback from religious organizations and individual viewers, but Family Guy has never faced the kind of violent threats that South Park encountered over its depiction of Muhammad. This disparity reflects the different risk profiles that various religious groups present in terms of organized responses to satire, as well as the different ways that the two shows approached religious commentary. South Park's Muhammad episodes were deliberately provocative in a way designed to test the boundaries of what could be depicted on television. Family Guy's religious humor, while sometimes shocking, has generally been deployed as part of the show's broader satirical framework, rather than as a specific challenge to any particular faith sensitivity. Family Guy's place in the broader landscape of adult animation has evolved significantly since its 1999 debut. When the show premiered, the field of primetime animated comedy for adults was essentially a three-show race between The Simpsons, South Park, and Family Guy. Each show occupied a distinct comedic territory. The Simpsons provided warm, character-driven humor with sharp satirical observation. South Park offered boundary-pushing political and social commentary with deliberately crude animation. Family Guy contributed rapid-fire pop culture references, non-sequitur cutaway gags, and a willingness to go for shock value that exceeded what either of the other shows attempted. Over the following 2 decades, the adult animation landscape expanded dramatically. Shows like Bob's Burgers, Archer, Rick and Morty, BoJack Horseman, and Big Mouth each carved out distinctive creative spaces that would have been harder to establish without the foundation that The Simpsons, South Park, and Family Guy had built. Family Guy's specific contribution to this expansion was proving that adult animated comedy didn't have to follow the character-driven sitcom format that The Simpsons had established. A show could be structured around jokes rather than stories, around moments rather than arcs, and still attract a massive audience. The show's influence on how comedy is written and consumed in the social media era connects to its structural innovation in ways that MacFarlane probably never anticipated. The cutaway gag format, which fragments narratives into discrete, shareable units, anticipated the way that platforms like TikTok and Instagram Reels would restructure comedy consumption decades later. Family Guy was making content that was optimized for short-form, context-free viewing years before the technology existed to distribute it that way. When those platforms did emerge, Family Guy clips became some of the most widely shared animated content on the internet, reaching audiences who had never watched a full episode on television. The show's continued production through 24 seasons and counting, with renewals secured through season 28, raises interesting questions about the life cycle of animated comedies and whether there's a natural endpoint for shows that have been running for more than a quarter century. The Simpsons has been on the air since 1989, making it the longest-running primetime animated series in American history. South Park has been running since 1997. Family Guy, despite its 3-year cancellation gap, has now been producing new content for a comparable span. Whether these shows remain creatively vital after decades of production is a subject that fans and critics debate endlessly. The general consensus among Family Guy's audience is that the show's peak quality occurred during seasons 4 through 8, the post-revival era, when the writers were energized by the show's unlikely return and the creative team was operating at maximum confidence. Later seasons have been criticized for relying too heavily on cutaway gags at the expense of character development, for becoming meaner in their humor without the warmth that balanced the early episodes, and for repeating premises and joke structures that felt fresh 15 years ago but have since become formulaic. The streaming data suggests that this critical assessment doesn't necessarily align with how audiences actually consume the show. Family Guy's status as the 4th most streamed show across all digital platforms in the first half of 2025 indicates that new viewers continue to discover the series and that existing fans continue to revisit it regardless of whether individual seasons meet the quality benchmarks set by the show's best years. The show has become a piece of cultural furniture, something that exists in the background of millions of people's lives, whether or not they're actively paying attention to it. Before we move on to the final stretch, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Now let's talk about something that brings all of this together in a way that nobody, not Seth MacFarlane, not the writers, not Fox, not anybody involved in the creation of this show, ever intended. Family Guy has become one of the most popular pieces of bedtime audio content on the internet. Millions of people fall asleep to this show every single night. And the reasons why reveal something genuinely interesting about how our brains process comfort, familiarity, and the strange relationship between controversial entertainment and psychological safety. Think about what Family Guy is on paper. It's a show featuring graphic violence played for laughs. Characters die, get maimed, and suffer injuries that would be horrifying in any other context. The humour is built on offensive jokes about race, religion, sexuality, and disability. Storylines involve scenarios that range from mildly inappropriate to genuinely disturbing. The cutaway gags frequently reference real-world tragedies, sexual situations, and bodily functions that polite company would never discuss. This is not what you'd expect to find on a list of relaxing content for bedtime. Nobody would design a sleep aid around crude animated humour and pop culture references. Yet here we are, YouTube compilations titled things like Family Guy to Fall Asleep to attract millions of views. The comment sections underneath these videos are filled with people describing how the show helps them relax and drift off. Streaming platforms report that Family Guy ranks among the most frequently played content during late-night hours. The show was the 4th most streamed television programme across all digital platforms in the first half of 2025, and a significant portion of that streaming happens between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. when viewers are winding down for sleep. So what's actually happening here? Why does a show that seems designed to provoke and disturb work as effectively as a lullaby for millions of adults? The first answer is vocal consistency. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter, Stewie, Brian, Quagmire, and dozens of other characters, which means that a single human voice forms the sonic backbone of nearly every episode. Even though these characters sound distinctly different from each other, they share underlying vocal qualities that come from being produced by the same set of vocal cords and the same brain. This creates a subliminal consistency that listeners' brains recognize and find comforting without consciously identifying why. Think about it this way. When you listen to a podcast hosted by one person, even if they're discussing topics that should be stressful or exciting, the consistency of their voice creates a rhythmic pattern that your brain can predict and settle into. Family Guy functions the same way, except that the one-person vocal performance is distributed across multiple characters, creating the illusion of varied conversation while maintaining the underlying consistency of a single performer. Peter's voice maintains a predictable pattern of cheerful stupidity that rarely escalates to genuine anger or threat. Kyle's voice, Stan's, actually, let's correct that. Stewie's voice carries a theatrical quality that, despite its content, operates within a predictable range of theatrical emphasis. Brian's voice is calm, measured, and intellectual, providing a baseline of vocal stability that grounds even the most chaotic scenes. Kenny's voice? No, that's the wrong show. Quagmire's voice follows its own predictable patterns, with the giggity catchphrase serving as a rhythmic anchor that listeners can anticipate. These voices have remained fundamentally unchanged for over 25 years. A person falling asleep to Family Guy in 2026 is hearing essentially the same vocal performances that they would have heard falling asleep to it in 2005 or 1999. The second answer is the cutaway structure, and this is the one that really matters for sleep content. Family Guy's signature format of interrupting storylines with brief unrelated gags creates a unique audio experience. Each cutaway is a self-contained moment that doesn't require the listener to remember what happened before it or to anticipate what comes after. If you drift out of consciousness during a cutaway, you miss nothing of consequence. If you wake up briefly during the next cutaway, you can immediately understand what's happening because the gag is designed to be comprehensible in isolation. Compare this to a show with strong narrative continuity. If you fall asleep during a Breaking Bad episode, you wake up confused about what happened to the characters and the plot. The anxiety of missing important information can actually disrupt sleep by creating a subconscious motivation to stay awake. Family Guy eliminates this anxiety entirely. There's nothing to miss. Every moment is its own contained unit. Your brain can let go because it knows that consciousness is not required to maintain the thread of the experience. The episodic nature of the show amplifies this effect. Most Family Guy episodes function as standalone stories that establish a premise, develop it, and resolve it within 22 minutes. Even the serialized seasons maintained relatively simple storylines that didn't require careful attention to previous episodes. This means you can start watching from any episode in any season and understand what's happening within seconds. There's no investment required, no homework, no need to remember what happened last week. You can press play on literally any episode and let it wash over you without effort. The third answer is familiarity, and specifically the kind of deep familiarity that transforms content from entertainment into ambient sound. Many current adults grew up watching Family Guy during their teenage years or young adulthood. The show represents a specific era in their lives. Hearing Peter's laugh, Stewie's accent, Brian's sarcasm, these sounds are connected to memories of watching television in a college dorm room, staying up late on a Sunday night, or binging DVDs at a friend's house. The audio triggers nostalgic associations that have nothing to do with the content of the jokes and everything to do with the emotional context in which those jokes were first heard. This nostalgic connection transforms Family Guy from something you're watching into something you're returning to. You're not consuming new content when you fall asleep to an episode you've seen 15 times. You're revisiting a familiar space. You know what jokes are coming. You know how the storylines resolve. You know which cutaway gags will appear. This predictability is the opposite of what makes for engaging television, but it's exactly what makes for effective sleep content. Your brain doesn't need to stay alert for surprises because there are no surprises. Everything is known. Everything is safe. And that safety allows your nervous system to stand down from the vigilance that keeps you awake. The fourth answer involves the specific emotional register that Family Guy operates in. The The show's comprehensive irreverence creates an emotional flatness that is, paradoxically, quite soothing. South Park can generate genuine anxiety because its satire sometimes targets things that viewers actually care about, and the show's willingness to make uncomfortable arguments can provoke real emotional responses. Prestige dramas generate tension by placing characters in danger and making the audience invest in their survival. Even other animated comedies like BoJack Horseman can produce genuine emotional distress by exploring themes of depression, addiction, and self-destruction with uncomfortable sincerity. Family Guy does none of these things, or rather, it does all of them, but in a way that immediately deflates the emotional weight through comedy. A moment that might generate real sadness is interrupted by a cutaway gag. A situation that might create genuine tension is undercut by a joke. The show constantly prevents emotional investment from building to levels that would interfere with relaxation. You never have to worry about the characters because you know they'll be fine by the end of the episode. Or even if they're not fine, the next episode will reset everything to the status quo. This emotional architecture is accidental. MacFarlane and his writers didn't design Family Guy to function as sleep content. They designed it to be funny, but the specific kind of funny they created, the non sequitur, context-free, self-deflating kind, happens to produce exactly the emotional conditions that facilitate falling asleep. The show occupies enough mental space to prevent anxious thoughts from dominating your attention, but it doesn't demand enough engagement to keep you awake. It's the Goldilocks zone of mental stimulation. Not too little, not too much, just enough to keep your mind occupied while your body relaxes. The fifth answer is audio design. Family Guy is a dialogue-driven show. The crude animation style means that important information gets communicated through what characters say rather than through visual storytelling. You don't need to watch the screen to follow what's happening because the characters explain everything through conversation. This makes the show function effectively as audio-only content, which is exactly how the majority of viewers consume it when they're falling asleep. The screen might be on, but your eyes are closed. You're listening, not watching. And Family Guy works beautifully as something to listen to because it was essentially an audio experience all along. The sound design supports this listening experience in subtle ways. Voice recordings are clear and well mixed, with dialogue always prominently placed in the audio mix. Background music, while sophisticated in composition, is mixed at levels that don't compete with the dialogue. Sound effects are present, but not jarring. The overall audio experience is smooth and listenable, without the sudden volume spikes or aggressive sound design that might startle a half-asleep listener back to full consciousness. Walter Murphy's orchestral scores contribute to the sleep-friendly audio environment in an unexpected way. The lush big band arrangements that accompany the show's scenes create a warm, sonic blanket that operates beneath the dialogue. The music is sophisticated enough to be pleasant, but not so attention-demanding that it prevents relaxation. It functions like a gentle ambient soundtrack that happens to accompany comedy, adding a layer of warmth to the listening experience that pure dialogue wouldn't provide. The sixth answer is the show's length and availability. Family Guy has produced over 400 episodes across 24 seasons, with more on the way. That's roughly 150 hours of content, more than enough to create extended listening sessions that span entire nights without repeating a single episode. Viewers who use the show as sleep content can queue up playlist after playlist without worrying about running out of material. The sheer volume of content means that the show can serve as a nightly companion for months without requiring the listener to make any decisions about what to watch. Hulu's autoplay feature compounds this effect by automatically advancing to the next episode when the current one ends. A viewer who presses play on a random Family Guy episode before bed will continue hearing new episodes throughout the night as they drift in and out of consciousness. The transitions between episodes are gentle enough that they don't disrupt sleep, and the consistent quality of the audio experience means that no single episode is likely to produce a jarring change in volume or tones that would wake the listener. The seventh answer, and perhaps the most important one, is the psychological function of comprehensive irreverence. Family Guy treats nothing as sacred. It mocks religion, politics, celebrities, historical events, social conventions, and every other aspect of human existence with equal enthusiasm. This comprehensive mockery creates a specific psychological state in the listener. When everything is being laughed at, nothing feels threatening. The world that Family Guy presents is absurd, cruel, chaotic, and completely without danger, because the comedy reframes every potentially threatening situation as a joke. For people who struggle with anxiety, stress, or the kind of late-night rumination that keeps minds racing when they should be resting, this reframing is genuinely therapeutic, not in a clinical sense, but in a practical, functional sense. The show's voice in your ear is telling you, through its humour, that the things you're worrying about are worthy of laughter rather than fear. The problems of the world become material for comedy rather than sources of dread. This shift in perspective, even if it only lasts for the 22 minutes of an episode, can be enough to break the cycle of anxious thinking that prevents sleep. The show's treatment of failure and incompetence contributes to this effect. Peter Griffin fails at virtually everything he attempts, often spectacularly. His failures result in injury, embarrassment, financial ruin, and social humiliation. And yet, by the end of every episode, he's back to normal. The failures have no lasting consequences. Life goes on. This message, delivered implicitly through the show's structure, rather than stated explicitly, communicates something comforting to viewers who are dealing with their own failures and anxieties. Things go wrong, people make mistakes, bad things happen, and then life continues. The show models resilience through incompetence, demonstrating that even the worst outcomes are survivable. The creators never intended any of this. MacFarlane built a satirical comedy designed to provoke, challenge, and entertain. The writers crafted jokes intended to make audiences laugh, gasp, and occasionally cringe. The production team created a visual and audio product designed for active engagement. Nobody in the creative chain was thinking about how this content would function as sleep assistance, but the unintended consequences of their creative choices produced something genuinely remarkable. A show that parents once feared would corrupt their children has become the audio companion that helps those same children, now adults, fall asleep at night. The crude humour that conservative watchdog groups called corrupting has become a source of comfort for millions of people navigating the stresses of adult life. The offensive content that generated FCC complaints and congressional attention now generates nothing more threatening than gentle, unconscious laughter as listeners drift off to sleep. There's something poetically appropriate about this transformation. Family Guy started as a thesis film created by a college student who was drawing characters in his kitchen at 4 a.m. It nearly ended before it began when its creator missed a doomed flight by 15 minutes. It was born, cancelled, buried, and resurrected through the determination of fans who bought DVDs in numbers that no one expected. It survived controversies, lawsuits, cast changes, network conflicts, writers' strikes, a global pandemic, and the complete transformation of the media landscape from broadcast television to digital streaming. And after all of that, after 27 years of pushing boundaries and generating headlines and winning Emmys and losing lawsuits and offending watchdog groups and delighting audiences, Family Guy found its most enduring purpose as something nobody planned. A bedtime story, a familiar voice in the dark, a friend who talks just enough to keep the worries at bay, but not so much that you can't close your eyes and let go. The show that Seth MacFarlane created because he wanted to make people laugh has ended up making millions of people feel safe enough to fall asleep. The animated comedy that was once considered too crude for network television has become comfort audio for an entire generation. The franchise that was cancelled twice and nearly lost its creator on September 11th, 2001, has survived long enough to become part of the nightly routine of people who weren't even born when it premiered. Sometimes the biggest surprises come from discovering what brings us peace, and sometimes the most controversial show in animation history turns out to be exactly what you need to hear before you drift off. Family Guy's effectiveness as sleep content stems from multiple converging factors that were never deliberately designed, but that create ideal conditions for relaxation. Seth MacFarlane's one-man voice performance across dozens of characters provides subliminal vocal consistency that listeners' brains find comforting. The cutaway gag structure creates self-contained audio moments that don't require sustained attention, eliminating the anxiety of missing important plot information. Over 400 episodes across 24 seasons provide more than 150 hours of content for extended listening without repetition. The show's comprehensive irreverence creates an emotional flatness that prevents anxiety by reframing every potentially threatening topic as comedy. The dialogue-driven format functions effectively as audio-only content because visual engagement is unnecessary to follow the show. Walter Murphy's orchestral scores add a warm sonic blanket beneath the dialogue. The nostalgic associations that many adult viewers have with the show transform it from entertainment into ambient comfort. And the show's treatment of failure through Peter Griffin's consequence-free incompetence communicates an implicit message of resilience that soothes anxious minds. What started as a thesis film by a 21-year-old animation student at RISD in 1995 became one of the most influential animated series in television history. It survived a near-death experience on September 11th, 2001. It was cancelled twice and revived through unprecedented DVD sales. It weathered controversies over banned episodes, cast recasts, writers' strikes, and a global pandemic. It expanded into Star Wars parodies, spin-off series, crossover events, and a streaming deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And somewhere along the way, without anyone planning it, it became the thing that millions of people reach for when the world gets too loud and sleep won't come. The show that was designed to keep you awake with shock and laughter has become the show that helps you fall asleep with familiarity and warmth. That's the most forgotten piece of Family Guy lore of all. Not the banned episodes, not the celebrity controversies, not the geographic impossibilities or the character transformations. The forgotten lore is that this crude, offensive, brilliant, occasionally heartfelt animated comedy has quietly become one of the most effective pieces of comfort media ever created. And that seems like the perfect place to let this go. Thanks for staying through 3 hours of forgotten lore. Whether you're still awake or already drifting, the show will be here tomorrow night, and the night after that, and the night after that. Some things, once they find their way into your life, never really leave. Family Guy is one of those things. Good night. Actually, before we fully settle into sleep mode, there's more forgotten lore that deserves attention. Because for every headline-grabbing controversy and every viral moment, there are dozens of quieter stories buried in Family Guy's history that reveal just how strange and fascinating this show's journey has been. Let's talk about the guest stars that even dedicated fans have completely forgotten about. Family Guy has attracted an absurd roster of celebrity voices across its run, and some of these appearances are so unexpected that even hardcore fans don't remember them. Drew Barrymore voiced Brian's girlfriend Gillian for a recurring role across seasons 5 and 6. The character was a beautiful but profoundly unintelligent woman who contrasted with Brian's intellectual pretensions, creating a dynamic where the dog who considered himself the smartest person in any room was dating someone who made Peter look like a Rhodes Scholar. Barrymore brought genuine warmth to the role, which made Gillian more sympathetic than the character might have been on paper. James Woods appeared as himself in multiple episodes spanning several seasons, becoming an increasingly unhinged version of his real-life persona, who developed a personal vendetta against the Griffin family. The character was killed, resurrected, and killed again across different episodes, reflecting the show's playful approach to continuity and its willingness to use the same character in contradictory ways when the comedy demanded it. The relationship between the show and the real James Woods became complicated as the actor's public political views shifted over the years, creating an uncomfortable gap between the fictional character and the person he was based on. Carrie Fisher's recurring role as Angela, Peter's boss at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, lasted from season 5 through her death in December 2016. Fisher brought her signature combination of toughness and vulnerability to the character, creating a boss figure who was simultaneously terrifying and sympathetic. Angela's eventual death within the show's timeline mirrored Fisher's real-life passing, though the show handled the departure more quietly than it might have given the character's significance. Patrick Stewart voiced Susie Swanson, Joe and Bonnie's baby daughter, in a recurring bit where the infant's inner monologue was revealed to be that of a sophisticated, contemplative adult voiced by one of the most distinguished actors in the English-speaking world. The contrast between the baby's appearance and Stewart's measured, philosophical delivery created one of the show's most consistently funny, recurring gags. Robert Downey Jr. appeared as Patrick Pewterschmidt, Lois's brother, in the season 6 episode The Fat Guy Strangler. The character was a mental patient who had been institutionalized after developing a compulsion to strangle overweight men. Downey's appearance came during a career resurgence that would soon lead to his casting as Iron Man, making this one of those guest spots that retrospectively seems much more significant than it did at the time. Liam Neeson, Adam West, Ryan Reynolds, Will Ferrell, Kate McKinnon, Johnny Depp in a limited capacity through impersonation, and dozens of other recognizable names have cycled through the show's guest roster. Many of these appearances lasted only a single scene or a few lines, making them easy to miss and even easier to forget. The show's willingness to attract high-profile talent and then use them for brief, sometimes unceremonious appearances reflected its confidence that the comedy didn't need celebrity star power to work. The celebrities were spice, not substance. The Conway Twitty gag represents one of Family Guy's most divisive creative choices, and one that perfectly encapsulates the show's relationship with its audience. Starting in season 7, the show began inserting extended clips of Conway Twitty, the country music singer who died in 1993, performing complete songs. These clips would run for 2 to 3 minutes of uninterrupted footage, replacing what would normally be several cutaway gags worth of comedy. The segments were not parodies. They were not modified or commented upon. They were simply Conway Twitty singing, presented with no context, no explanation, and no punchline. The reaction from fans was predictably divided. Some viewers found the Conway Twitty gags to be brilliantly absurd, a form of anti-comedy that was funnier than any actual joke could have been because it violated every expectation of what a primetime animated comedy was supposed to do with its precious airtime. Others found the gags to be lazy filler, a transparent attempt to eat up runtime without doing the creative work of producing original comedy. The debate over whether the Conway Twitty segments were genius or garbage became one of the most persistent arguments within the Family Guy fan community. The show's use of the chicken fight running gag tells a different kind of story about how a simple comedic premise can evolve across decades of production. The first chicken fight appeared in season 2 when Peter had an altercation with Ernie the giant chicken over an expired coupon. The fight was a brief, ridiculous sequence that parodied action movie choreography by having a cartoon man and a giant chicken engage in an escalating physical battle that destroyed property across Quahog. The chicken fights became a recurring element, appearing in subsequent seasons with increasingly elaborate choreography and longer runtimes. Each new fight escalated the scope and destruction beyond the previous one, incorporating vehicles, weapons, explosions, and action movie set pieces that pushed the show's animation capabilities. The fights functioned as pure spectacle, providing visual excitement that contrasted with the show's normally static animation style. In 2025, after 23 seasons, the show confirmed that Ernie the giant chicken had been killed off permanently. The character, who had survived dozens of seemingly fatal encounters across more than 2 decades of episodes, had finally met his definitive end. The decision to retire the chicken fights reflected both the creative exhaustion of the premise and the practical reality that each new fight required increasingly elaborate animation to surpass the ones that came before. The show's holiday episodes form their own sub-tradition within the broader Family Guy canon. Christmas episodes have been a consistent feature since Season 3's A Very Special Family Guy Freakin' Christmas, which aired in 2001 and established the template for the show's approach to holiday specials. These episodes typically featured seasonal storylines that mixed traditional holiday sentimentality with the show's characteristic irreverence, creating episodes that were simultaneously heartwarming and deliberately offensive. The Season 9 episode A Road to the North Pole represented the most ambitious of these holiday specials. In the episode, Brian and Stewie travel to the North Pole to confront Santa Claus, only to discover that Santa was overworked, physically deteriorating, and operating a Christmas factory staffed by mutant elves that had been bred for maximum productivity. The episode won the Emmy for Outstanding Sound Mixing for a comedy or drama series in 2011, making it one of the few individual Family Guy episodes to receive specific awards recognition beyond the broader voice acting categories. Now let's talk about some of the plot developments and storylines that shaped the show in ways that don't get discussed enough. The episode where Peter discovers that Lois is technically Jewish because her mother converted to Christianity from Judaism triggered a brief but surprisingly thoughtful exploration of religious identity. The episode raised questions about whether religious identity is determined by birth, practice, belief, or community affiliation, treating these questions with more nuance than viewers might expect from a show that usually reduces religion to punchline material. The Brian and Stewie bottle episode from Season 8 placed the two characters alone in a bank vault for the entire runtime. With no cutaway gags, no other characters, and no change of setting, the episode forced the show to rely entirely on the relationship between its two most complex characters. The result was one of the most emotionally honest episodes in the show's history, featuring conversations about loneliness, purpose, and the meaning of friendship that would have felt at home on a much more serious program. The Season 12 episode Into Harmony's Way featured Peter and Quagmire accidentally forming a successful folk music duo, allowing the show to explore themes of artistic collaboration and creative partnership that clearly resonated with MacFarlane's own experiences as part of the creative partnerships that had defined his career. The musical performances in the episode were played straight rather than for laughs, demonstrating that the show could produce genuinely impressive musical content when it chose to. The show's handling of political humour evolved significantly across its run. Early seasons featured relatively even-handed political satire that mocked both conservatives and liberals with comparable enthusiasm. Later seasons, particularly those produced during and after the 2016 presidential election, shifted toward more explicitly liberal political perspectives that reflected the general alignment of the Hollywood creative community. This shift alienated some viewers who had appreciated the show's earlier approach of mocking everyone equally, while satisfying others who felt that the political climate demanded clearer moral positioning. Peter's relationship with Lois has been one of the show's most complicated ongoing dynamics. In the earliest episodes, Peter and Lois had a recognizable sitcom marriage where Peter's foolishness was balanced by genuine love and commitment. As the show progressed, the marriage became darker. Peter's treatment of Lois grew more dismissive and occasionally cruel. Lois's responses shifted from patient tolerance to resentment and occasional retaliation. Some episodes depicted their marriage as fundamentally toxic, while others returned to the warmer dynamics of the early seasons without acknowledging the darker intervening episodes. This inconsistency in the marital dynamic reflects the broader challenge of maintaining character relationships across hundreds of episodes produced by different writing teams over multiple decades. Each writer's room brings its own interpretation of how these characters relate to each other, and without a single, consistent creative vision guiding every episode, the tone and quality of the relationships can shift dramatically from one episode to the next. The show's treatment of current events has always been complicated by its production timeline. Unlike South Park, which can produce episodes in less than a week, Family Guy requires months of production lead time. This means that the show's commentary on current events is always retrospective rather than immediate. An episode about a political scandal might air 6 months after the scandal broke, by which point the public conversation has moved on. This lag has been both a limitation and a strength. It prevents the show from being a first responder to breaking news, but it also forces the writers to engage with events at a level of depth that immediate reactions rarely achieve. The show's approach to meta-humor and self-reference has become increasingly prominent in later seasons. Characters break the fourth wall to acknowledge that they're in a television show. Jokes reference the show's own history, its ratings, its creative controversies, and its relationship with other animated series. Peter has directly addressed the audience in several episodes, commenting on plot developments and creative choices in ways that blur the line between the fictional character and the writers who control him. This meta-awareness gives the show a unique position in the animated comedy landscape. Family Guy knows what it is. It knows what people think about it. It knows which elements of its comedy have aged poorly and which have stood the test of time. And rather than ignoring this awareness, the show incorporates it into its comedy, creating a recursive loop where the show comments on itself commenting on itself. Whether this approach represents sophisticated, postmodern storytelling or lazy navel-gazing depends entirely on your perspective, and probably varies from joke to joke. The voice acting consistency that we discussed earlier in relation to sleep content also represents one of the show's most remarkable technical achievements from a pure craft perspective. MacFarlane has now voiced these characters for over 25 years. The human voice naturally changes with age, becoming deeper, rougher, or less flexible over time. Maintaining consistent character voices across that span requires both technical skill and careful attention to the vocal qualities that define each performance. Listening to Peter Griffin in a 1999 episode and a 2025 episode reveals subtle changes in MacFarlane's delivery, but the core voice remains recognizable and consistent in ways that demonstrate genuine vocal discipline. The show's sound editing team deserves particular credit for maintaining the audio quality that makes Family Guy work as both active entertainment and passive listening content. Each episode goes through extensive post-production sound work, including dialogue editing that ensures clarity, sound effect placement that creates spatial awareness, and music mixing that balances Murphy's orchestral scores against the dialogue and effects tracks. The result is an audio product that sounds professional and polished regardless of whether you're watching intently on a large screen or half listening through phone speakers as you fall asleep. Family Guy's legacy in animation cannot be separated from the specific cultural moment that produced it. The show arrived at the end of the 1990s, a decade defined by ironic detachment, consumer culture, and the last gasp of monoculture, before the internet fragmented American media consumption into countless niche audiences. MacFarlane's comedic sensibility was shaped by this environment, producing humour that was simultaneously cynical and sincere, offensive and affectionate, juvenile and sophisticated. The show survived into the 2000s, the 2010s, and now the 2020s by adapting to cultural shifts while maintaining the core elements that defined it from the beginning. The cutaway gags remained, the voice cast remained, the crude humour remained. But the targets evolved, the references updated, and the show's willingness to engage with changing social norms allowed it to remain relevant, even as the culture that produced it transformed beyond recognition. 24 seasons, over 450 episodes by some counts, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue across broadcast, streaming, DVD sales, and merchandising. Multiple Emmys, cancelled twice, revived once, almost lost to a hijacked airplane, survived everything the entertainment industry, religious organizations, watchdog groups, and the changing tastes of the American public could throw at it. And at the end of all of it, the most remarkable thing about Family Guy might be the simplest one. People still watch it, people still laugh at it, people still fall asleep to it. In a media landscape where content is disposable and attention spans are measured in seconds, a show about a fat guy in a Rhode Island town has endured for more than a quarter of a century. Seth MacFarlane once said that his priority in sitcoms was making people laugh, that it was job number one, and everything else was secondary. 27 years in, the laughs are still coming, and for millions of viewers, so is the sleep. Good night. Actually, there's one more stretch of forgotten lore we should cover before we truly let this go. Because the deeper you dig into Family Guy's history, the more you find stories that nobody talks about anymore, but that fundamentally shaped what the show became. The Stewie as villain to Stewie as complex character transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because the writers realised something important about long-form animated storytelling. A one-note character can sustain a show for 3 seasons, maybe 5 if the writers are clever. But maintaining a character across 10, 15, 20 seasons requires depth that the original concept might not have included. MacFarlane has spoken about this transformation in interviews, noting that the world domination version of Stewie had essentially been exhausted creatively by the time the show returned from cancellation. Every possible variation of the baby, trying to kill his mother or conquer the world, had been explored. The character needed somewhere new to go, and the writers found that somewhere in Stewie's vulnerability, his confusion about his own identity, and his relationship with Brian, which became the most emotionally honest partnership in the show. The Brian and Stewie dynamic works because it inverts the expected hierarchy. Brian is the adult, the intellectual, the one who should be providing guidance and wisdom. Stewie is the infant, the one who should be learning from and depending on the adults around him. But in practice, Stewie is far more intelligent, capable, and emotionally aware than Brian, who uses his pretensions to mask deep insecurity and self-doubt. The relationship works because both characters need each other in ways that neither fully acknowledges. Brian needs Stewie's genuine regard to feel valued. Stewie needs Brian's companionship to feel less alone in a family that, aside from Brian, rarely engages with him as a person, rather than as a baby. The road to episodes crystallized this dynamic into what many fans consider the best content Family Guy has ever produced. Each road to adventure strips away the supporting cast and the cutaway gag format, forcing Brian and Stewie to carry entire episodes through their interactions alone. The result is something closer to a 2-character play than a typical animated sitcom episode, with the comedy arising from the friction between 2 distinct personalities trapped together in increasingly absurd situations. Road to the Multiverse, which we've already discussed as the highest rated episode on IMDb, represents the pinnacle of this format. The episode's journey through parallel dimensions gave the animators freedom to experiment with completely different visual styles. While the writing maintained the Brian and Stewie banter, the that audiences had come to love. The Disney Universe sequence, which reimagined the characters in lush feature-quality animation, demonstrated that Family Guy's creative team was capable of producing visually stunning work when they chose to, making their decision to maintain the show's deliberately simple aesthetic a conscious choice rather than a limitation. There's a production detail about the show that almost nobody knows, and that reveals something interesting about how animated comedies manage their relationship with broadcast standards. Family Guy maintains two versions of many episodes. The broadcast version, which airs on Fox and is subject to the network standards and practices department, and the DVD, or streaming version, which includes content that was cut for broadcast. These differences range from minor dialogue changes to entire scenes that were deemed too explicit, too controversial, or too long for the broadcast slot. The existence of dual versions creates a strange situation where the definitive version of a Family Guy episode depends on where you watch it. Fans who only watch on Fox or Hulu may be experiencing a sanitized version of episodes that were originally conceived to include material that was removed before broadcast. DVD collectors who have access to the uncut versions often point to specific scenes as evidence that the broadcast versions are incomplete representations of the writer's intentions. This dual version system also means that episode ratings and reviews can vary depending on which version the reviewer watched. A critic who sees the broadcast version might have a different impression of an episode's quality than a viewer who watches the uncut DVD version, which might include additional jokes, extended scenes, or more explicit content that changes the tone of the episode. The financial structure behind Family Guy's continued production reveals how the economics of animated comedy have evolved since 1999. When the show premiered, its revenue came primarily from advertising during Fox broadcasts and from international distribution deals. The DVD revolution of the early 2000s created a massive secondary revenue stream that literally saved the show from permanent cancellation. By the 2000s, streaming rights had become the most valuable piece of the economic puzzle, with platforms like Hulu paying significant licensing fees for exclusive access to the show's catalogue. The April 2025 renewal deal that extended Family Guy through season 28 reflected a media landscape where streaming viewership was more important than broadcast ratings. The show's linear television numbers had declined to below 2 million viewers per episode, a fraction of its early season highs. But its streaming performance, ranking as the fourth most watched show across all digital platforms in the first half of 2025, told a completely different story. The deal was structured around the reality that Family Guy's audience existed primarily on streaming platforms rather than in front of traditional television sets. This shift has implications for how the show's produced and what kind of content it creates. Broadcast episodes need to fit into specific time slots and adhere to network standards. Streaming content can be more flexible in both length and content. The Hulu holiday specials that began airing in 2024 represented an experiment in creating Family Guy content specifically designed for a streaming audience rather than a broadcast one. These specials could be longer, edgier, and less constrained by the advertising breaks and content standards that shape broadcast episodes. The show's cultural significance extends into areas that academic researchers have begun to study seriously. Media studies departments at universities have produced papers analysing Family Guy's approach to race, gender, disability, and political satire. The show has been the subject of at least one full-length academic book examining its cultural impact. Courses on American animation frequently include Family Guy episodes in their syllabi, alongside The Simpsons and South Park, treating the show as a significant cultural text worthy of scholarly analysis. This academic attention would have seemed absurd in 1999, when the show was widely dismissed as a crude Simpsons knockoff with no creative ambition beyond shock value. The fact that Family Guy is now studied alongside The Simpsons in university classrooms reflects how dramatically the show's cultural status has changed over its 27-year run. What was once considered disposable entertainment is now treated as a meaningful artifact of American popular culture. The voice actors' relationship with their characters across decades of production creates psychological dynamics that are rarely discussed publicly. When you voice a character for 25 years, the character becomes an extension of your identity in ways that are difficult to separate. MacFarlane has spoken about how performing Peter's voice feels different from performing Stewie's voice, not just technically, but emotionally. Each character occupies a different space in his creative psychology, representing different aspects of his humour, his worldview, and his emotional range. Alex Borstein has described similar experiences with Lois, noting that the character has become a familiar enough presence in her life that she sometimes thinks in Lois's voice when dealing with frustrating situations in her real life. Seth Green has maintained the Chris Griffin voice for so long that the character's particular brand of awkward vulnerability has become second nature. These long-term relationships between actors and animated characters represent a form of creative commitment that doesn't exist in most other entertainment formats. Live-action actors change roles every few years. Voice actors in animated films complete their work in months. But the core Family Guy cast has been performing the same characters for a quarter of a century, creating bonds between performer and role that are arguably deeper and more sustained than any comparable creative relationship in entertainment. The future of Family Guy, with its guaranteed renewal through season 28, stretches into at least 2028 or 2029. By that point, the show will have been in production for 3 decades, placing it in the same conversation as The Simpsons as one of the longest-running entertainment franchises in American history. Whether the show maintains creative vitality across that span or gradually becomes a legacy property that coasts on institutional momentum and streaming nostalgia is a question that only time can answer. What seems certain is that Family Guy has earned its place in the permanent cultural landscape of American entertainment. The show that started as a college thesis film survived a cancellation that should have been permanent and accidentally became one of the most popular pieces of sleep content on the internet, has demonstrated a durability that defies every expectation. MacFarlane was 21 when he drew Larry Cummings on a piece of paper in his kitchen at RISD. He'll be in his mid-50s by the time the current renewal deal expires. The talking dog, the evil baby, the fat guy, and the family that is somehow held together through over 400 episodes show no signs of going anywhere. The story of Family Guy is, at its core, a story about persistence. It's about a creator who refused to stop making the thing he loved, an audience that refused to let that thing die, and a set of characters who have become so deeply embedded in American culture that they've transcended their origins as crude animated figures on a cartoon show. They've become companions. They've become comfort. They've become the voices that millions of people hear as they close their eyes at the end of a long day and wait for sleep to come. And that, right there, is the most forgotten piece of Family Guy lore. Not the banned episodes, not the 9/11 near miss, not the cancellation saga, or the DVD revolution, or the celebrity controversies. The forgotten lore is that somewhere along the way, between the offensive jokes and the cutaway gags and the chicken fights, Family Guy became something that people genuinely need. Not just want, need. The way you need a familiar blanket or a cup of tea, or the sound of rain on a window. The show occupies a space in people's lives that goes beyond entertainment into something closer to ritual. 3 hours of forgotten lore, and we've barely scratched the surface. There are episodes we didn't cover, characters we didn't discuss, controversies we didn't explore, and production stories that will probably never be told publicly. Family Guy has produced enough content across enough years to fill volumes of analysis and every season adds more material to the pile. But for now, this is enough. Whether you made it through all 3 hours with your eyes open, or whether you drifted off somewhere around the discussion of Quahog's impossible geography, thank you for being here. The show will still be on when you wake up. It's been on for 27 years. It'll be on for at least a few more. Sweet dreams. Giggity. Wait, actually, there are a few more pieces of forgotten lore that we really should cover, because the rabbit hole goes deeper than even the most dedicated fans realise. The show's relationship with its own opening credits tells its own fascinating story. The Family Guy opening sequence, set to the theme song composed by Walter Murphy with lyrics by MacLeod, features the entire Griffin family singing together at a piano. The lyrics begin with the words, "It seems today that all you see is violence in movies and sex on TV." The song is a deliberate throwback to the All in the Family opening, where Archie and Edith Bunker sang "Those Were the Days," establishing Family Guy as a spiritual successor to the tradition of boundary-pushing American sitcoms. The theme song has remained functionally unchanged throughout the show's entire run, with only minor visual and audio remasters. When the show transitioned to HD in Season 9, the opening credits were updated to match the new aspect ratio and resolution, but the song itself, the arrangement, the vocal performances, and the basic visual concept remain the same. This consistency gives Family Guy one of the most stable opening credit sequences in television history, a 3-decade constant in a show that changes almost everything else from episode to episode. MacFarlane's performance of the theme song reflects his genuine talent as a vocalist. He is a legitimate singer who has released multiple albums of great American songbook standards and performed live at Carnegie Hall, the Hollywood Bowl, and the Royal Albert Hall. His Grammy-nominated vocal work represents a side of his career that most Family Guy fans never explore. The same voice that produces Peter Griffin's moronic declarations and Stewie's theatrical pronouncements is capable of performing jazz standards with the kind of technical precision and emotional nuance that professional vocalists spend decades developing. This duality, the crude comedy writer who is also a sophisticated musician, reflects something fundamental about MacFarlane as a creative figure. He is simultaneously the guy who writes jokes about bodily functions and the guy who can sit at a piano and deliver a Cole Porter ballad that would hold up in any Manhattan jazz club. Family Guy exists in the space between these two impulses, which is why the show can feature Walter Murphy's lush orchestral scores alongside fart jokes without either element feeling out of place. The show's approach to time travel and science fiction elements represents another underexplored area of Family Guy lore. Stewie's time machine, which appeared in numerous episodes before being destroyed in the life of Brian Ark and later rebuilt, provided the show with a narrative device that could justify virtually any storyline. Time travel episodes sent characters to historical periods, alternate timelines, and potential futures, creating stories that were unconstrained by the normal rules of the show's contemporary setting. The Season 9 episode, The Big Bang Theory, not to be confused with the CBS sitcom, featured Stewie and Brian accidentally causing the Big Bang itself, establishing within the show's canon that Stewie was literally responsible for the creation of the universe. This revelation had no lasting consequences for the character or the show's continuity, which is perfectly consistent with Family Guy's approach to its own mythology. The show can establish that one of its characters created all of existence and then never mention it again, because continuity has never been the point. Stewie's rivalry with his half-brother Bertram spanned multiple episodes and involved time travel, attempted murder, and philosophical questions about whether preventing someone's birth constituted killing them. Bertram, who shared Peter's DNA through a sperm bank donation, represented a mirror version of Stewie who possessed similar intelligence but directed it toward more straightforwardly malicious purposes. The rivalry culminated in a time travel confrontation that sent both characters to Renaissance-era Italy, where Stewie had to protect Leonardo da Vinci because the artist was revealed to be his ancestor. These science fiction storylines gave the writers freedom to explore concepts and scenarios that a purely domestic sitcom could never accommodate. Family Guy could tell stories about parallel dimensions, time paradoxes, and the nature of reality itself, then return to Peter drinking at the Drunken Clam the following week, as though nothing had happened. This flexibility was built into the show's DNA from the moment Stewie first appeared as an infant who could build death rays and dimensional portals in his bedroom. The show's musical episodes deserve special attention because they reveal the full range of the production team's capabilities. Family Guy has produced original songs that span genres from show tunes to country to hip-hop to jazz, often with production values that rival actual commercial music releases. The song You Have AIDS from the Season 2 episode Peter Griffin, Husband, Father, Brother, combined a barbershop quartet arrangement with deliberately offensive lyrics to create a number that was simultaneously catchy, well-produced, and deeply inappropriate. The song became one of the most widely shared pieces of Family Guy content online, demonstrating how musical numbers could achieve viral distribution independent of the episodes that contained them. The Season 3 song Prom Night Dumpster Baby featured a Broadway-style production number about abandoned infants that was so musically accomplished that it received a digital release as a standalone track. Shapoopy, adapted from the musical The Music Man, appeared in the Season 4 episode Patriot Games and featured an elaborate choreographed sequence that demonstrated the animation team's ability to produce complex musical staging when given the opportunity. The Christmas album Family Guy Live in Vegas, released in 2005, collected many of the show's musical performances along with new material recorded specifically for the album. The release treated the show's songs as legitimate music products rather than mere television novelties, and the album found an audience among fans who appreciated both the comedy and the genuine musical craft behind it. In 2024, a 25th anniversary EP was released digitally featuring some of the show's most popular musical numbers, acknowledging that these songs had achieved a cultural life beyond the episodes they originated in. The EP treated You Have AIDS, Shapoopy, and Prom Night Dumpster Baby as defining musical works of the franchise, a distinction that would have seemed absurd in 1999, but felt entirely appropriate after 25 years of cultural penetration. The show's relationship with the city of Providence, Rhode Island, extends beyond simple geographic inspiration. MacFarlane's years at RISD left a lasting impression that surfaces throughout the show in ways that only Rhode Islanders tend to notice. Specific Providence landmarks, restaurants, and cultural institutions appear as background details in Quahog scenes. The accent that characters occasionally use reflects actual Rhode Island speech patterns rather than the generic New England accent that most shows default to. The social dynamics of Quahog, where old money and working-class families coexist in uncomfortable proximity, mirrors the actual class structure of Rhode Island communities like Providence and Newport. RISD itself has acknowledged its connection to Family Guy's origin story, and MacFarlane has maintained ties with the institution that launched his career. His lecture at RISD on the night before September 11th, 2001, the event that led to his hangover and his missed flight, demonstrates that his relationship with the school continued long after graduation. The connection between a prestigious art school and one of the crudest comedies in television history creates an irony that MacFarlane himself has noted with amusement. The physical production space where Family Guy is created, the Fuzzy Door Productions facility in Los Angeles, functions as the nerve center of MacFarlane's creative empire. The building houses the writing rooms, recording studios, and production offices where not only Family Guy but also American Dad and MacFarlane's other projects are developed. The name Fuzzy Door comes from a description of a door in MacFarlane's childhood home, giving his production company a personal touch that connects his professional output to his Connecticut roots. The writing room dynamics at Fuzzy Door have evolved significantly across the show's run. In the early seasons, MacFarlane was heavily involved in the day-to-day writing process, contributing ideas, jokes, and structural guidance for every episode. His departure from active writing in 2010 created a transition period where the show's creative identity had to be maintained by writers who had inherited the franchise rather than originated it. The succession of showrunners, including David Zuckerman, David A. Goodman, Chris Sheridan, Mark Henteman, Steve Callahan, Alex Sulkin, and Richard Appel, each brought their own sensibilities to the show while working within the framework that MacFarlane had established. This transition from founder-led to team-led creative production is one of the least discussed but most significant changes in Family Guy's history. The show that airs in 2026 is fundamentally a different creative product from the show that aired in 2005, not because the characters or format have changed, but because the creative team making decisions about tone, content, and direction has turned over multiple times. Whether the current version of Family Guy is better or worse than earlier versions is subjective, but the fact that it continues to attract massive streaming audiences suggests that the creative team has maintained enough of the original formula to satisfy the audience's expectations. And with that, we really have covered 3 hours of forgotten Family Guy lore, from a college thesis film in 1995 to a streaming juggernaut in 2025. From a near-death experience on September 11th to a 28-season renewal deal. From a cancelled show that came back through DVD sales to a bedtime companion for millions of adults. The story of Family Guy is a story about how a single creative vision can survive every obstacle that the entertainment industry, the cultural landscape, and pure random chance can throw at it. Sleep well. Peter, Stewie, Brian, and the rest of the Griffins will be here whenever you need them. They always are. One last thing before we truly close this out. There are a handful of production facts and hidden details that sit at the very bottom of the forgotten lore iceberg. Things that even people who consider themselves experts on the show don't know about. The show's pilot episode, Death Has a Shadow, went through an unusual development process. MacFarlane pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May 1998, which was shorter than the standard animated pilot presentation. The network executives were impressed enough to order 13 episodes, 7 of which aired during the first season. The remaining 6 were held back or reworked for season 2. This means that the first season of Family Guy, which many fans consider the show's creative foundation, was actually an incomplete representation of the initial creative output. Episodes that were produced as part of the original order didn't air until months after the show had already established its identity with audiences. The budgetary constraints of the first season forced creative decisions that became permanent features of the show. The limited animation style wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was a financial necessity. MacFarlane and his team couldn't afford the kind of detailed animation that The Simpsons had been producing for a decade. Instead, they developed a visual approach that was deliberately simple, using flat backgrounds, minimal character detail, and static compositions that required fewer animation frames per second than more visually ambitious shows. This constraint became a feature. The simple visual style made the show easier to produce, faster to animate, and more adaptable to the compressed production schedules that television demands. The casting process for the supporting characters reveals how much of Family Guy's eventual identity was determined by chance rather than planning. Patrick Warburton, who voices Joe Swanson, was cast partly because of his distinctive deep voice and partly because of his availability. Warburton had established himself as a character actor through roles in Seinfeld and other shows, bringing a gravitas to Joe that made the character's wheelchair-bound tough guy persona more convincing than a less commanding voice would have achieved. The character of Joe was designed to fill a specific role in Peter's friend group, providing law enforcement perspective and physical contrast, but Warburton's performance gave the character depth and humanity that the original concept might not have supported. The decision to give Quagmire a catchphrase was similarly organic. MacFarlane developed the giggity sound during voice recording sessions, and it stuck because the sound captured something essential about the character's personality. Catchphrases in animation can feel forced when they're designed by committee, but giggity worked because it emerged from the performance rather than being imposed on it. The sound is simultaneously funny, slightly disturbing, and instantly recognizable, making it one of the most efficient pieces of character branding in animation history. Cleveland Brown's bathtub gag, where a cutaway or disaster would cause Cleveland to fall from his house while sitting in a bathtub, yelling, "No, no, 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 no," as he plummeted, became one of the show's longest-running physical comedy bits. The gag appeared in dozens of episodes across multiple seasons, each time playing out with the same basic structure, but with slight variations in context and Cleveland's reaction. The repetition was part of the joke. Viewers knew it was coming, anticipated it, and still found it funny because the execution was reliable and the voice performance sold it every time. The show's relationship with its own commercialization tells an interesting story about how animated comedies navigate the tension between artistic integrity and revenue generation. MacFarlane has been open about the fact that Family Guy's continued production is driven partly by financial considerations rather than purely creative ones. The show generates significant revenue through licensing, merchandising, and streaming deals that fund not only the show itself, but also MacFarlane's other creative ventures. This candor about the business side of animation is rare among show creators, who typically prefer to frame their continued work in purely artistic terms. The merchandise that Family Guy has generated across its run reflects the show's evolving cultural position. Early merchandise from the late 1990s and early 2000s leaned heavily into the show's transgressive reputation, featuring Stewie with weapons and Peter in compromising positions. Later merchandise became more sophisticated, with premium collectibles, limited edition art prints, and collaboration products targeting adult collectors rather than impulse buyers. The shift mirrors the show's audience evolution from young viewers attracted to shock value to established fans willing to invest in quality products associated with a cultural property they've followed for decades. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, Peter's employer for much of the show's run, underwent its own narrative arc across seasons. The brewery served as a stand-in for the kind of regional manufacturing business that defines many New England communities, producing a local beer that residents consumed out of civic loyalty as much as personal preference. The brewery's various ownership changes, production crises, and labor disputes reflected real economic pressures facing American manufacturing, though these serious themes were always filtered through the show's comedic lens. The relationship between Peter and his boss Angela, voiced by Carrie Fisher, provided some of the show's most effectively deadpan comedy. Angela's flat effect and complete absence of enthusiasm contrasted perfectly with Peter's manic energy, creating workplace scenes that captured the soul-crushing boredom of office life more accurately than many live-action workplace comedies managed. Fisher's death in 2016 removed this dynamic from the show permanently, and no subsequent boss character has replicated the specific chemistry that Peter and Angela shared. The show's approach to disability through Joe Swanson evolved from straightforward comedy about a cop in a wheelchair to a more nuanced exploration of how disability affects identity, relationships, and self-perception. Early Joe episodes treated his paraplegia as a source of visual gags and situational comedy. Later episodes explored Joe's frustration with his limitations, his anger at being pitied, and his struggle to maintain his identity as a capable, masculine authority figure, despite needing physical assistance for basic activities. This evolution didn't always succeed. Some episodes handled disability with genuine sensitivity, while others retreated to cheap wheelchair jokes. But the attempt to develop Joe beyond his initial conception as the handicapped friend showed that the show was capable of growth even when it didn't always achieve it consistently. Herbert, the elderly predator character, remained controversial throughout the show's entire run. Voice actor Mike Henry created the character's distinctive, high-pitched, wheezy vocal quality and his unsettling fixation on Chris Griffin. The character appeared in virtually every season, his behaviour never receiving consequences or condemnation within the show's narrative. Whether this represented the show's commitment to never treating any topic as off-limits, or a genuine blind spot in the writer's moral compass depended on the viewer. The character's popularity among some fans, who found his extreme inappropriateness funny precisely because it was so far beyond acceptable behaviour, coexisted with genuine discomfort from other viewers who felt that paedophilic behaviour should never be played for laughs regardless of context. These character details, production stories, and hidden creative decisions form the bedrock of Family Guy's identity. The show exists as the sum of thousands of individual choices made by hundreds of creative professionals across nearly 3 decades of production. Every voice, every gag, every musical cue, every animation frame represents a decision that contributed to the cultural phenomenon that millions of people now fall asleep to every night. The forgotten lore of Family Guy is, in the end, not really forgotten at all. It's simply absorbed. It becomes part of the background radiation of the show's existence, the invisible foundation that supports the visible entertainment that appears on screen. You don't need to know that Peter's voice is based on a security guard at RISD to find him funny. You don't need to know that MacFarlane nearly died on September 11th to appreciate his creative output. You don't need to know about the DVD revolution, or the Parents Television Council, or the Cleveland Brown recast to enjoy falling asleep to the sound of familiar voices telling familiar jokes in a familiar fictional town. But knowing these things adds depth to the experience. It transforms background noise into narrative. It turns a show you listen to into a story you understand. And if you're still awake right now, after 3 hours of forgotten lore, then maybe you understand Family Guy a little better than you did when we started. Or maybe you fell asleep 2 hours ago and this is just audio wallpaper now. Either way, the show did its job. Good night for real this time. See you in Quahog.